Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The night had teeth, and they were sinking deep. I stumbled down Madison Street with the bitter taste of rejection still coating my tongue like cheap whiskey. The sidewalk beneath my feet felt unsteady, though I couldn't tell if it was the alcohol or something else entirely making the world tilt at wrong angles. Street lamps cast sickly yellow pools of light that stretched and warped as I passed beneath them, my shadow dancing like a puppet with cut strings. The woman at Murphy's pub had looked right through me when I'd approached her table. Not past me, not around me, through me, as if I were made of smoke and bad intentions. Her friends had snickered when I'd asked if I could buy her a drink, their laughter sharp enough to cut glass. The memory burned worse than the bourbon I'd drowned it in afterward. My apartment building loomed 6 blocks ahead, a concrete monolith that promised nothing but 4 walls and the echo of my own breathing. The October air bit through my jacket, raising goosebumps along my arms that had nothing to do with temperature. Something felt wrong about the night, though I couldn't pinpoint what. The streets were too quiet for a Friday evening, as if the city itself was holding its breath. That's when I heard it. Marcus. The voice drifted through my skull like smoke through water, feminine and soft, carrying an intimacy that made my skin crawl. I stopped walking, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs with the force of a trapped bird. The sound hadn't come from outside. It had whispered directly into the folds of my brain, bypassing my ears entirely. I spun around, scanning the empty street behind me. Nothing. No one. Just the skeletal branches of dead trees reaching toward a starless sky like arthritic fingers. My breath came out in short puffs of vapor that dissipated quickly in the cold air. Marcus. There it was again, closer this time, as if whoever was speaking had stepped inside my head and was now standing behind my eyes. The voice carried a weight that made my teeth ache, a familiarity I couldn't place but that settled in my stomach like spoiled meat. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to squeeze out the sound, but it only seemed to burrow deeper. The street lamp directly above me flickered once, twice, then died with a soft electric sigh. I started walking again, faster now, my footsteps echoing off the empty buildings that lined the street like tombstones. The whiskey fog in my brain was burning off, replaced by something sharper and more immediate. The primal recognition that I was being hunted. Another lamp died as I passed beneath it, plunging me into a pocket of darkness that felt thick enough to swim through. Then another, and another. The lights were going out in sequence, following my movement down the sidewalk like a wave of artificial night. Each extinguished bulb left behind a patch of shadow that seemed to writhe and pulse with its own malevolent life. My walking turned into a jog, then a run. My legs felt unsteady, rubbery from the alcohol and the adrenaline now flooding my system. Behind me, I could hear the soft pop of bulbs burning out in perfect timing with my desperate flight. The darkness was chasing me, consuming the light in my wake like some hungry living thing. Marcus, don't run from me. The voice was stronger now, no longer a whisper, but a full-throated call that reverberated through the hollow spaces of my skull. It carried an undertone of disappointment, the way a mother might scold a child who'd tracked mud through the house. The familiarity of it made my chest tighten with panic I couldn't name. I knew that voice. God help me, I knew it. My breath came in ragged gasps that tasted of copper and fear. The buildings around me seemed to lean inward as I ran, their windows black and reflective like dead eyes. In their surfaces, I caught glimpses of movement, shadows that didn't match my own, shapes that followed just behind my peripheral vision but vanished when I turned to look directly at them. The street stretched ahead of me like a tunnel, my apartment building still impossibly far away despite the blocks I'd covered. Time felt elastic, stretched thin like taffy, each second lasting an eternity, while the darkness continued its methodical pursuit. Pop. Another light died. Pop. Another patch of night claimed its territory, My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, a desperate percussion that drowned out everything except the steady click of my footsteps and the soft, inexorable death of the street lamps. Sweat ran down my back despite the cold, soaking through my shirt and jacket until the fabric clung to my skin like a burial shroud. "You can't escape what you've done, Marcus." The words hit me like a physical blow, staggering me mid-stride. I stumbled, nearly falling, and had to grab a nearby fire hydrant to keep myself upright. The metal was ice cold against my palm, so cold it burned. The voice was different now, not just familiar, but known. Intimately, terrifyingly known. Sarah. The name rose from some locked compartment in my mind, bringing with it a flood of memories I'd spent months trying to drown in alcohol and self-pity. Sarah, with her laugh like wind chimes and her habit of humming old songs under her breath. Sarah, who'd left me 6 months ago with nothing but a note on the kitchen table and the lingering scent of her perfume on the pillows. But Sarah was in Portland now, living with her sister, starting over without the dead weight of our failed relationship dragging her down. She couldn't be here, couldn't be speaking inside my head with a voice that sounded wrong, too hollow, too empty, like an echo of an echo. "You drove me away, Marcus. You and your drinking, your anger, your suffocating need." I wanted to argue, to deny it, but the words stuck in my throat like fish bones, because it was true, all of it. I had driven her away with my jealousy and my paranoia, my inability to believe that someone like her could love someone like me without eventually realizing her mistake. I'd checked her phone, followed her to work, questioned every friendship and every moment she spent away from our apartment. The street lamp ahead of me died with a sound like breaking glass. I forced myself to start moving again, though every step felt like walking through quicksand. The darkness behind me was complete now, a solid wall of black that had swallowed half the street. In its depths, I could see shapes moving, tall, thin figures that glided rather than walked, their outlines shifting and flowing like smoke made solid. "You're so alone now, aren't you, Marcus? Just like you always said you'd be." The voice was coming from everywhere now, not just inside my head, but from the shadows themselves, from the spaces between buildings, from the cracks in the sidewalk beneath my feet. It multiplied and layered until it became a chorus of Sarah's, all speaking in perfect unison, all carrying that same tone of disappointed affection. My apartment building was finally visible, its familiar brick facade rising like a lighthouse in the storm of my panic. The lobby windows glowed with warm yellow light that looked like salvation from where I stood. Just 2 more blocks, just a little farther. But the darkness was faster than I was. It flowed around me like liquid night, cutting off my view of the building, the street, everything except the small circle of dying light where I stood. The last functioning street lamp above me flickered desperately, its bulb glowing brighter and dimmer in rapid succession like a heart in cardiac arrest. In the encroaching shadows, figures began to emerge. Tall and impossibly thin, they moved with a fluid grace that hurt to watch. Their faces were blanks of shadow punctuated by eyes that reflected light like mirrors. They didn't approach me directly but circled instead, patient predators waiting for their prey to exhaust itself. "Do you remember what you said to me, Marcus? The last night we were together?" I did remember. God, I remembered every word, every gesture, every tear that had rolled down her cheeks as I'd screamed about her imaginary betrayals and my pathetic insecurities. I'd told her that no one would ever love her the way I did, that she'd regret leaving me, that she'd be sorry when she realized what she'd thrown away. You said I'd come back to you. You said I'd realize my mistake. The shadowy figures were closer now, close enough that I could see the details that made them wrong. Their limbs were too long, jointed in places where joints shouldn't be. Their heads tilted at angles that would have snapped a human neck. And their eyes held a terrible, knowing sadness that made my knees buckle. Well, Marcus, I came back. The last street lamp died with a sound like a gunshot, plunging me into absolute darkness. But I could still see the figures, see them as clearly as if they were illuminated by some internal light. They formed a perfect circle around me, their mirror eyes reflecting nothing but darkness. In the center of the circle, a new figure began to materialize. This one was different, smaller, more human in its proportions. As it solidified, I recognized the shape of her shoulders, the way she held her head, the familiar curve of her profile. Sarah stood before me, but not the Sarah I remembered. This version of her was translucent, shifting like heat shimmer, her eyes black holes in a face pale as moonlight. When she smiled, I could see too many teeth, all of them sharp. "You wanted me to come back, didn't you? You wanted me to realize what I'd lost." I tried to speak, to explain, to apologize, but no sound would come. My throat had closed completely, as if invisible hands were squeezing my windpipe. The fear was so intense it had become a physical presence, sitting on my chest like a lead blanket. "Well, here I am, Marcus, and I do realize what I lost." She began walking toward me, her feet making no sound on the pavement. With each step, she became more solid, more real, until I could smell her perfume, that same floral scent that had haunted our apartment long after she'd gone. I lost my peace, Marcus, my sleep, my sense of safety. You took all of that from me with your obsession, your need to possess rather than love. The circle of shadow figures began to contract, closing in like the iris of a camera. I spun around, looking for an escape route, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness was complete, absolute, pressing against me from all sides. But you know what the funny thing is? Sarah's voice was directly behind me now. I could feel her breath on the back of my neck, cold as winter wind. I turned slowly, knowing I didn't want to see what I was about to see, but unable to stop myself. Her face was inches from mine, so close I could count the individual flecks of gold in her black eyes. But those weren't her eyes. They were holes, tunnels that led down into something vast and hungry and utterly alien. The funny thing is, I'm not real. The words hit me like ice water, shocking me back into some semblance of rational thought. The street lamps around me flickered back to life in reverse sequence, their light driving back the shadows until they were nothing more than ordinary darkness pooling beneath parked cars and doorways. I was standing alone on an empty street corner, 3 blocks from my apartment building. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely get my keys out of my pocket. The taste in my mouth was sour, acidic, the flavor of too much whiskey and not enough food. There was no circle of shadow figures, no impossible Sarah with her mirror eyes and sharp-toothed smile. Just me, drunk and pathetic and talking to ghosts that lived only in the guilty corners of my own mind. But as I stumbled toward home, I could still hear her voice echoing in the spaces between my thoughts, soft and sad and infinitely disappointed. "I'm not real, Marcus. But your guilt is. And it's been waiting for you to come home." The apartment building's entrance was lit by 2 security lights that cast everything in harsh white relief. As I fumbled with my keys, trying to get the door unlocked before whatever was following me could catch up, I caught my reflection in the glass door. For just a moment, just a split second, I wasn't alone in that reflection. There was a figure standing behind me, tall and thin and wrong in all the ways that mattered. Its eyes were mirrors, and in those mirrors, I could see myself as I really was. Small, broken, drowning in the toxicity of my own making. The door opened with a click, and I stumbled into the lobby's blessed normalcy. Behind me, the street was empty, lit by functioning lamps that cast ordinary shadows. But I knew, with the certainty that comes from staring too long into the dark corners of your own soul, that somewhere out there, in the spaces between what's real and what we fear might be real, something was still calling my name. And someday, when I was drunk enough or desperate enough or just tired enough of carrying the weight of what I'd done, I might be tempted to answer. Story 2. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon torn from the night sky. its edges dissolving into darkness that seemed to breathe. My headlights carved out a pitiful cone of visibility in the suffocating void, barely reaching 50 yards before the shadows devoured everything. The dashboard clock glowed 2:47 a.m., its green numbers floating in the cabin like dying stars. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, pushing through the exhaustion that made my eyelids heavy as lead curtains. The coffee from the last gas station had long since worn off, leaving behind a bitter metallic taste that coated my tongue like rust. My fingers ached from gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white as bone in the dashboard's dim glow. Route 184 was a forgotten artery that cut through the belly of nowhere, connecting two small towns that most people had never heard of. No streetlights, no reflectors, just cracked asphalt and the occasional rusted guardrail that disappeared into ravines I couldn't see the bottom of. The kind of road that existed on old maps but seemed to phase in and out of reality depending on how desperate you were to find it. That's when I first noticed the sedan. It appeared in my rearview mirror like a thought I couldn't shake, its headlights two yellow eyes boring into the back of my skull. The distance between us remained constant, maybe 50 yards, close enough that I could make out the boxy outline of what looked like an older model, though the darkness made specifics impossible. Its lights never wavered, never blinked, just held their position like they were tethered to my bumper by invisible cable. My foot eased off the accelerator. The speedometer needle drifted from 70 to 65. The sedan slowed with me, maintaining that perfect distance. I pressed down again, pushing back to 75. The yellow eyes stayed exactly where they'd been. The first prickle of unease crawled up my spine like a cold finger tracing my vertebrae. My heart began to beat just a fraction faster, that subtle shift from regular rhythm to something more urgent. I told myself it was coincidence, that whoever was behind me was probably just as tired as I was, using my taillights as a guide through the darkness. But coincidence has limits. I signaled left and moved into the passing lane, though there was nothing to pass except empty road and the ghosts of roadkill that appeared and vanished in my headlights. The sedan didn't follow immediately. For a moment, the mirror showed only darkness, and I felt a rush of relief that made my shoulders relax. Then the headlights were there again, not emerging from behind me, not sliding over from the right lane, just there, as if they'd never moved at all. The same distance, the same unwavering stare. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp intake that seemed to echo in the confined space of my car. I blinked hard, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks on my perception. Highway hypnosis could make you see things, make time skip like a scratched record. But when I opened my eyes, the sedan was still there, still watching. My palms began to sweat against the steering wheel, leaving damp impressions on the leather. The air conditioning was running, but suddenly the car felt stifling, as if the oxygen was being slowly siphoned away. I cracked the window, and the night air rushed in with the sound of wind through dead leaves, though I couldn't see any trees. I moved back to the right lane. This time I watched the rearview mirror with the intensity of a man waiting for his execution. The sedan's headlights flickered once, like an eye closing and opening, then vanished. Empty road stretched behind me, dark as the bottom of a well. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat so forceful I could feel it in my temples. I counted to 10, then 20, waiting for the lights to reappear. Nothing, just the red glow of my own taillights reflecting off the guardrail. Relief flooded through me like warm water, followed immediately by embarrassment. I was losing it, letting fatigue and an overactive imagination turn a fellow traveler into some kind of supernatural stalker. I needed sleep, needed to find a motel, and the lights were back. This time they were closer, maybe 30 yards, close enough that I could see they weren't perfectly round but slightly oval, with a faint blue tint around the edges that reminded me of cataracts. The sedan's grille was a black mouth filled with chrome teeth, and though I couldn't make out the driver through the windshield, I had the distinct impression that whoever was behind the wheel was smiling. My foot found the brake pedal almost involuntarily. The car slowed, and I expected the sedan to rear-end me or swerve around. Instead, it slowed too. maintaining that impossible distance like we were connected by some invisible force. The taste of copper filled my mouth. I'd bitten my tongue without realizing it, and now blood mixed with the bitter residue of old coffee. My hands trembled on the wheel, a fine vibration that seemed to spread through my entire body. I tried the left lane again, signaling though there was no one to signal to except whatever was following me. The mirror showed empty darkness for exactly 3 seconds before the headlights materialized again, in the same position, at the same distance. This time I was watching when it happened. One moment the mirror reflected nothing but night. The next those oval eyes were there, as if they'd been painted onto the glass by an invisible hand. No movement, no transition. Just absence, then presence. My breathing became shallow, rapid pants that fogged the inside of the windshield. The defogger couldn't keep up, and condensation spread across the glass like ice forming on a pond. I wiped it away with my sleeve, leaving streaks that fractured my vision into prismatic fragments. The sedan was getting closer, not gradually, not with any detectable movement, but in discrete jumps like frames in an old film reel. 30 yards, then 25, then 20. Each time I checked the mirror, it had gained ground without seeming to move at all. I pressed the accelerator to the floor. The engine roared, and my speedometer climbed past 80, past 90. The road surface was rough, and the car shuddered with each imperfection in the asphalt. Wind noise screamed through the partially open window, but underneath it I could hear something else. A sound like static, or whispers, or insects crawling through dead leaves. The sedan kept pace effortlessly. 15 yards now. Close enough that I could see the windshield was completely dark, not tinted but actually dark, as if it were a hole cut in the world rather than glass. The headlights seemed brighter now, more intense, and I realized they weren't reflecting off the road surface the way they should. No twin beams stretched ahead of the sedan, no glare on the wet asphalt. The light simply existed, 2 burning points suspended in space. My vision began to tunnel, the edges of my perception darkening until all I could see was the road directly ahead and those terrible eyes behind me. My heart rate spiked to the point where each beat felt like a fist striking my chest from the inside. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes and making my shirt cling to my back like a second skin. I tried to call out, to break the silence that pressed against my eardrums like deep water, but my throat had constricted to nothing. Only a strangled wheeze emerged, barely audible over the engine's roar. The exit for Millfield appeared in my headlights like salvation. I yanked the wheel right, tires squealing as I took the off-ramp at 70 miles per hour. G-forces pressed me against the door as the car tilted, threatening to roll. But I held it, straightened out on the exit ramp, and finally allowed myself to look in the rearview mirror. The sedan was gone. The interstate stretched empty behind me, my skid marks the only evidence that anything had happened at all. I pulled over at the first gas station I found, a fluorescent-lit oasis that buzzed with dying insects. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key out of the ignition. Inside, the clerk was a thin man with hollow eyes who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. He watched me approach with the expression of someone who'd seen too many late-night travelers on the edge of breakdown. I asked him about the sedan, described what I'd experienced, my words tumbling over each other in their urgency. He listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, his face revealing nothing. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me about the accident on Route 184, the one that had happened 15 years ago. A sedan had lost control during a storm, gone through the guardrail, and disappeared into one of those black ravines. They'd never found the car or the driver, he said. But sometimes, late at night, people reported seeing headlights that didn't behave the way they should. I bought a cup of coffee with hands that still trembled and sat in my car under the harsh fluorescent lights. The warmth helped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The world seemed less solid now, full of gaps where impossible things could slip through. When I finally worked up the courage to continue my journey, I took the back roads, avoiding Route 184 entirely. But every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, for just a split second, I expected to see those oval headlights materializing out of nothing. They never appeared again that night. but the feeling of being watched never entirely went away. Even now, months later, I find myself checking the mirror more often than I should, my heart rate spiking whenever I see headlights that seem to maintain too perfect a distance. Because deep down, in a place I don't like to examine too closely, I know the sedan is still out there, still following, still waiting for the right moment, the right road, the right combination of darkness and isolation to resume its patient pursuit. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the roads are empty, I wonder if it's following someone else now, or if it's simply waiting for me to make the mistake of taking Route 184 again. The thought makes my palms sweat and my breath catch, but it also fills me with a terrible certainty. Next time, I won't be lucky enough to find an exit. Story 3. Some nights, the darkness between one heartbeat and the next stretches long enough to swallow reason whole. This was one of those nights. The rain had been hammering my windshield for the better part of an hour when Rex started whining from the back seat. His bladder had terrible timing, as usual. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder of Highway 47, a stretch of asphalt that carved through pine forests so thick they seemed to absorb sound itself. The headlights cut through sheets of rain, illuminating nothing but wet pavement and the ghostly outline of tree trunks that pressed close to the road's edge. My hands trembled slightly as I shifted into park. The coffee from the gas station had been stronger than expected, leaving my nerves raw and my heart beating just a little too fast. Rex scratched at the door, his claws scraping against the vinyl with that fingernails on chalkboard sound that made my teeth ache. I stepped out into the downpour, immediately feeling the cold water seep through my jacket and down my neck. The air smelled of wet earth and something else, something organic and foul, like vegetables left too long in a basement. Rex bounded out after me, disappearing into the darkness beyond the headlight beams, with the enthusiasm only a German shepherd could muster for relieving himself in a storm. That's when I saw him. He stood directly in front of my car, perhaps 20 feet away, caught in the harsh white glare of my high beams. A tall figure in a long, dark overcoat that hung past his knees, the fabric so black it seemed to absorb the light around it. Water should have been streaming off the coat, but I couldn't see any. His face remained hidden in shadow despite the brightness aimed directly at him, as if the light simply refused to touch his features. My breath caught in my throat. The logical part of my brain scrambled for explanations. A hitchhiker, someone whose car had broken down, a good Samaritan checking if I needed help. But logic felt thin out here, stretched gossamer fine against the weight of something fundamentally wrong. I called out to him, my voice barely audible over the rain, asking if he needed assistance. He didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there like a monument to stillness while the storm raged around him. My heart began to pound harder, each beat reverberating in my chest cavity like a fist against a drum. The coffee jitters mixed with something deeper, more primal. The hairs on my arms stood up beneath my soaked jacket sleeves. I reached for the headlight switch, thinking perhaps the high beams were too bright, blinding him. The moment I clicked them down to regular headlights, he vanished. Gone, as if he had never been there at all. I stood there for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, rain streaming down my face, staring at the empty patch of asphalt where he had been. My breathing came in short, sharp bursts that created small clouds of vapor despite the warm summer air. Rex bounded back from the tree line, shaking water from his coat and looking at me with the satisfied expression of a dog who had accomplished his mission. He seemed completely oblivious to what I had just witnessed, which somehow made it worse. Dogs were supposed to sense these things, weren't they? Supernatural presences, malevolent entities, whatever the hell that had been. I walked slowly toward the front of my car, my shoes squelching in the muddy gravel. The headlights now illuminated nothing but empty road and falling rain. But as I got closer to the vehicle, something made my stomach lurch. There, on the hood of my car, were footprints, fresh mud, still glistening wet in the headlight glare. The prints were enormous, easily sized 13 or 14 boots, and they led from the exact spot where the figure had been standing right up to my car. But they didn't stop at the front bumper. They continued up onto the hood itself, as if someone had walked up the front of my vehicle like it was a ramp. The mud was too fresh to have been there when I stopped. It wasn't there when I got out of the car, but it was there now, clear as day, impossible to deny. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone to take a picture, but the screen remained black no matter how many times I pressed the power button. Dead battery, which was impossible because it had been at 60% when I checked it at the last gas station. Rex had gotten back into the car and was watching me through the windshield with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to reflect far too much understanding. I climbed back into the driver's seat, my clothes dripping onto the upholstery, and sat there for a moment trying to process what had just occurred. The logical explanations crumbled under scrutiny. Hitchhikers didn't disappear when you adjusted your headlights. They didn't leave footprints on your car hood. They didn't stand perfectly still in torrential rain without getting visibly wet. I started the engine with fingers that refused to stop trembling and pulled back onto the highway. Every shadow beyond the headlight beams now seemed to hide potential figures in overcoats. Every reflection in my mirrors could have been him, standing behind my car, following at a distance just out of sight. The rain continued to fall, but it no longer sounded like rain. It sounded like fingers tapping on the roof of my car. Hundreds of fingers, all tapping in a rhythm that almost matched my accelerated heartbeat but was just slightly off, creating a syncopated percussion that made my skin crawl. Miles passed, but the landscape seemed to repeat itself. The same bend in the road, the same cluster of pine trees, the same guardrail with the same dent in it. I began to wonder if I was driving in circles, though that was impossible on a straight highway. Unless the road itself had changed, unless reality had become negotiable. My mouth felt desert dry despite the humidity. I reached for the water bottle in my cup holder, but my hand froze halfway there. In the rearview mirror, I could see the back seat clearly. Rex sat there, alert and calm as always. But there had been someone else there, just for a split second. A tall figure in a dark overcoat, sitting perfectly still in the corner of the back seat. I whipped my head around to look directly, but saw only Rex and empty upholstery. When I looked back at the mirror, nothing. Just my dog and my own paranoia reflected in the glass. The speedometer read 65, but it felt like I was crawling through molasses. Time had taken on a liquid quality, stretching and contracting without warning. I would check the clock on the dashboard and see 11:47 p.m. Then what felt like an hour later, it would read 11:48 p.m. Then suddenly it would jump to 12:15 a.m. without any memory of the intervening time. A truck stop appeared in my headlights like a mirage, its neon signs flickering in colors that seemed too bright, too saturated for the rain-washed night. I pulled in, desperate for human contact, for fluorescent lights and the mundane comfort of other people going about their ordinary lives. The parking lot was empty except for a single 18-wheeler, its cab dark and silent. The truck stop itself glowed like a beacon, but something about the light seemed wrong. It cast shadows that bent at impossible angles, shadows that moved independently of the objects that should have created them. I sat in my car for several minutes, engine running, windshield wipers squeaking against glass that was no longer wet. The rain had stopped without my noticing, but I couldn't remember when. Rex had fallen asleep, his breathing deep and regular, a sound that should have been comforting but only emphasized how alone I felt. Through the truck stop's windows, I could see movement inside. People, or things that looked like people, moving with a jerky, marionette-like quality that made my vision blur when I tried to focus on them directly. A clerk behind the counter who seemed to have too many arms. Customers who cast no reflections in the glass doors of the refrigerated section. My phone had somehow come back to life, showing full battery and perfect signal strength. I called my wife, desperate to hear her voice, to anchor myself to something real and familiar. She answered on the first ring, but her voice sounded distant, as if she were speaking through layers of static I couldn't quite hear. She told me she'd been worried, that I should have been home hours ago. When I tried to explain what had happened, the words came out wrong, rearranged into sentences that made no sense even to me. She kept asking me to repeat myself, growing more concerned with each iteration. The conversation ended abruptly when my phone went dead again. this time with a sound like breaking glass that seemed to come from inside my skull rather than the device itself. I looked back at the truck stop and saw him standing in the doorway, the figure in the overcoat, perfectly framed in the entrance, his face still hidden in shadow despite the blazing fluorescent lights behind him. He raised one arm, too long, the proportions all wrong, and seemed to beckon to me. Every instinct screamed at me to drive away, to floor the accelerator and not look back. But a deeper part of me, some ancestral understanding of predator and prey, knew that running would only make things worse. That he could follow. That distance meant nothing to something like him. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The air no longer smelled of rain and earth. It smelled of copper and ozone, like the aftermath of lightning strikes. My footsteps echoed strangely in the empty parking lot, creating reverberations that seemed to come from underground. Rex woke up and began to whine, a low, continuous sound that raised the hair on the back of my neck. He pressed himself against the car window, his eyes wide with an animal terror that needed no explanation. The figure waited as I approached, never moving, never acknowledging my presence except for that impossibly long arm still extended in invitation or command. With each step, the fluorescent lights inside the truck stop flickered more violently, creating a strobing effect that made walking feel like moving through a series of still photographs. When I was perhaps 10 feet away, I finally saw his face. It wasn't a face at all. It was a mirror, reflecting my own features back at me, but wrong. My eyes were too wide, my mouth stretched in a rictus of terror I wasn't aware I was wearing. My skin had taken on a pallor that spoke of illness or worse, and there were shadows under my eyes that looked like bruises. But it was still unmistakably me, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. The figure spoke without moving his mirrored mouth, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing inside my skull like my own thoughts spoken aloud. He told me things I didn't want to hear, truths about the nature of reality that made my knees weak and my vision swim, about the thin places where one world bleeds into another, about the watchers who stand in those spaces, reflecting back what they see, showing people their true selves stripped of all comfortable illusions. He told me I had been driving through one of those thin places for hours, maybe days, caught in a loop of my own fear and doubt. That every mile I thought I had traveled had taken me deeper into somewhere that existed between certainty and nightmare. But he also told me there was a way out. There was always a way out, for those willing to pay the price. The price was simple: acknowledgement. I had to accept what I had seen, what I was seeing, what it meant about the nature of reality and my place in it. I had to stop running from the truth that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than I had ever allowed myself to believe. I stood there in that impossible parking lot, under those strobing lights, staring into my own terrified face reflected in his non-face, and made my choice. I nodded. The moment I did, everything changed. The strobing stopped. The artificial light became warm and normal. The smell of copper faded, replaced by the ordinary odors of diesel fuel and hot dogs from the grill inside. Through the windows, I could see a perfectly normal clerk reading a magazine, and a trucker buying coffee like it was the most mundane thing in the world. The figure in the overcoat was gone, but I knew he wasn't really gone. He would always be there, standing just at the edge of perception, reminding me that the comfortable reality I inhabited was just one layer of something infinitely deeper and more complex. I walked back to my car on unsteady legs. Rex greeted me with his usual enthusiasm, as if nothing had happened, as if we hadn't just spent eternity trapped in a pocket of twisted space-time. But I could see in his eyes that he remembered everything, and that he understood we had both been changed by what we'd experienced. The drive home took exactly the amount of time it should have taken, through familiar landscapes under a normal sky. But I found myself checking the mirrors obsessively, watching for tall figures in dark coats, for footprints on my hood, for signs that the thin places were opening up again. I never told anyone what happened that night. How could I? But sometimes, late at night, when the rain is falling hard enough to muffle all other sounds, I catch glimpses of him in my peripheral vision. standing at the end of my driveway, or in the reflection of my bedroom window, or in the back seat of my car when I'm driving alone. He's not threatening anymore. He's just there. A reminder that I chose to see the world as it really is, and that once you make that choice, you can never go back to the comfortable blindness of ignorance. The footprints on my car hood had vanished by morning, but I know they were real. Just as real as the figure who left them, as real as the choice I made that night, as real as the knowledge that somewhere, in the spaces between what we think we know and what actually is, watchers in overcoats wait patiently for the next traveler to stop their car on a dark highway and step out into a larger, more terrible world than they ever imagined possible. And sometimes, on nights when the rain falls just hard enough and the darkness presses just close enough, I find myself grateful for his presence. Because knowing the truth, even when it's terrifying, is better than living a lie, even when that truth means you're never really alone. Story 4. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like dying insects, casting sickly shadows across the rows of abandoned pool tables. Dust motes floated through the stale air like tiny ghosts, and somewhere in the building's depths, pipes groaned with the weight of years and neglect. I should have known better than to take a job cleaning out Mickey's game room after it had been shuttered for 3 years. The pay was too good, the timeline too generous, and when Mrs. Chen handed me the keys, her fingers trembled slightly as they brushed mine. She mentioned something about the previous cleaning crew quitting after just 1 day, but I figured they'd probably found something better. People are flighty these days. The heavy steel door creaked open to reveal a tomb of forgotten entertainment. 12 pool tables stretched across the main floor like green islands in a sea of peeling linoleum. The felt on most tables had gathered dust so thick it looked like snow, and several cue sticks lay scattered on the floor where they'd been dropped and never picked up. Neon beer signs hung dark and lifeless on the walls, their once bright promises now just shadows of colored glass. I started with the basics, sweeping, wiping down surfaces, inventorying what could be salvaged and what needed to be hauled to the dumpster. The work was methodical, almost meditative, and for the first few hours I fell into a comfortable rhythm. The only sounds were my footsteps, the scrape of my broom, and the occasional protest from the building's aging bones. It was while cleaning the third table that I noticed something odd. The balls on table 7, positioned in the far corner beneath a flickering fluorescent tube, weren't scattered randomly like the others. They were arranged in a precise formation, the cue ball at one end, the 8 ball directly in the center, and 6 other balls creating a perfect straight line between them. The shot was geometrically impossible. No player could sink the 8 ball without the cue ball having to pass through solid matter. I chalked it up to some kid's idea of a prank before the place closed down and continued working. But the formation nagged at me. Something about the precision felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. By late afternoon, my shirt clung to my back with sweat despite the building's persistent chill. The heating had been shut off years ago, and my breath formed small clouds as I worked. I'd made good progress, clearing 6 tables completely and getting a solid start on the others. That's when I decided to take a break and check on table 7 again. The balls had moved. My chest tightened as I stared at the green felt. The formation was identical. Cue ball, 8 ball, 6 others in a perfect line, but it was now positioned on the opposite end of the table. Every ball had shifted, maintaining their impossible alignment but rotating the entire setup 180 degrees. My hands started to shake as I pulled out my phone to take a picture, but the camera wouldn't focus properly in the dim light. I told myself someone must have come in while I was in the back room. Maybe Mrs. Chen had stopped by to check on my progress, but I hadn't heard the front door, hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't heard anything except the building's constant mechanical whispers. I forced myself to keep working, but my attention kept drifting to table 7. Every time I glanced over, the balls seemed to gleam a little brighter in the sickly fluorescent light, as if they were generating their own subtle luminescence. The temperature in the room began to drop noticeably as evening approached. My breath came in thicker puffs, and I could feel the cold seeping through my jacket. I cranked up a small space heater I'd brought, but it seemed to make no difference. The cold felt targeted, concentrated around table 7 like an invisible fog. That's when I heard the first sound. It was barely audible, a soft clicking, like two balls touching gently together. I froze, mop in hand, and strained to listen. The sound came again, rhythmic and deliberate. Click, pause, click, pause, click. I crept toward table 7, my sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. The balls appeared motionless, but as I watched, I could swear I saw the slightest tremor in the cue ball. Just a tiny vibration, as if something was calling to it from across the felt. My throat felt dry as sandpaper. I reached out to touch the cue ball, and the moment my fingertip made contact, it rolled forward 3 inches and stopped. The 8-ball responded immediately, rolling backward the exact same distance. The other balls followed suit, each moving in perfect synchronization to maintain their impossible line. I jerked my hand back, heart hammering against my ribs. The balls settled into their new positions with soft whispers against the felt, and then everything went silent except for the blood rushing in my ears. I grabbed my phone and called Mrs. Chen, but it went straight to voicemail. My voice cracked as I left a message explaining that I might need to delay the cleaning by a day or two, that there were some complications I needed to sort out. I didn't mention the balls. How could I? She'd think I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. I decided to pack up for the day, but as I gathered my supplies, I couldn't resist one more look at table 7. The balls had moved again. This time, they'd shifted to form the same line but perpendicular to their previous position, creating a cross pattern with their earlier trajectory still visible in the dust. My legs felt weak as I stumbled toward the exit, but something made me stop. On impulse, I grabbed a pool cue from the wall rack and approached table 7. If something was playing games with me, I was going to play back. I lined up the shot exactly as the balls seemed to be suggesting. Cue ball to 8-ball through the impossible line of obstacles. It was physically absurd, like trying to thread a needle with a rope, but I drew back the cue and struck. The cue ball rolled forward with perfect speed and trajectory. Instead of colliding with the first ball in the line, it seemed to phase through it, continuing its path without disturbing a single obstacle. It struck the 8-ball with a solid thunk and sent it rolling toward the corner pocket. But the 8-ball stopped 1 inch from the pocket's edge and rolled backward, retracing its path until it settled exactly where it had started. Every other ball on the table began moving simultaneously, repositioning themselves into the same impossible formation I'd first discovered. The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in thick white clouds, and frost began forming on the windows. The fluorescent lights started flickering in a rapid staccato pattern, casting the room into strobing shadows. The clicking sound returned, but now it was coming from every table in the room. I looked around in growing panic and saw that every pool table now displayed the same impossible ball formation. 12 identical setups, 12 perfect lines, 12 shots that defied the laws of physics. The clicking grew louder, more insistent, like a dozen metronomes counting down to some unknowable deadline. My vision began to blur at the edges. The room felt like it was tilting, the floor becoming unsteady beneath my feet. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples, and my shirt was soaked with cold sweat despite the freezing air. That's when I saw him. A figure stood at the far end of the room, barely visible in the strobing light. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned vest and bow tie. His face was pale and gaunt, and his eyes reflected the fluorescent flicker like polished stones. He held a pool cue in his right hand, gripping it with the confident familiarity of someone who'd spent countless hours perfecting his technique. He raised the cue and pointed it at me, then gestured toward table 7. His mouth moved, but I couldn't hear his words over the mechanical clicking that now filled the room like the sound of 1,000 clockwork insects. I understood anyway. He wanted me to take the shot, the real shot, the one that would complete whatever game had been left unfinished when Mickey's closed its doors. My legs carried me toward table 7 without conscious direction. The cue felt warm in my trembling hands, as if it had been waiting for me specifically. The balls gleamed with their own inner light now, pulsing gently in rhythm with my heartbeat. I lined up the shot one more time, the impossible shot, the one that would either end this nightmare or trap me in it forever. But as I drew back the cue, I finally understood what I was really looking at. This wasn't about physics or supernatural phenomena. This was about obsession, about someone who'd spent so many hours in this room, so many years perfecting shots and calculating angles, that he'd become part of the place itself. The figure across the room nodded encouragingly, his pale face almost eager. He'd been waiting for someone to complete his final game, his masterpiece shot that had consumed his thoughts until the day Mickey's closed and left him with nothing but an unfinished table and an impossible dream. I could take the shot. I could satisfy his obsession and maybe find peace for both of us. Or I could walk away and leave him to wait for the next person willing to play his game. The cue trembled in my hands as I made my choice. I set it down on the table and stepped back. Some games aren't meant to be finished. Some obsessions are better left incomplete. The figure's expression crumbled into something between rage and desperate pleading, but I was already walking toward the door. Behind me, the clicking grew to a crescendo that sounded like applause or condemnation. I couldn't tell which. I left Mickey's game room that night and never went back. Mrs. Chen received my resignation by email, along with a recommendation that she hire a demolition crew instead of a cleaning service. Some buildings are better torn down than restored. But sometimes, when I pass by the old arcade on my way to other jobs, I can still hear the faint sound of clicking through the boarded windows. And I know that somewhere in that darkness, 12 pool tables still display the same impossible shot, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to finally sink the 8-ball and end the game. I just hope it's never me. Story 5. The GPS died exactly when I needed it most. Its blue glow fading to black as rain hammered against the windshield like skeletal fingers tapping for entry. The interstate stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into a throat of darkness that seemed to swallow my headlights whole. My gas gauge needle kissed the red zone, and the nearest station, according to my last signal, was still 40 miles away. That's when I saw the exit ramp, unmarked, barely visible, cutting away from the main road like a secret whispered in the dark. I should have known better. Should have trusted my gut when it twisted into knots the moment I turned onto that narrow strip of cracked pavement. The road was older than the interstate, its surface pocked with holes that jarred my teeth and made my spine ache. Ancient trees pressed close on both sides, their branches intertwining overhead to form a tunnel of shadows that my headlights could barely penetrate. The rain had stopped, but the silence that replaced it felt worse. Too complete, too deliberate, as if the world itself was holding its breath. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white against the worn leather. The air inside the car grew thick and stale, despite the ventilation running full blast. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, but the fuel gauge reminded me that retreat might not be an option. I'd committed to this path, and now I had to see it through. That's when I saw the first one. It stood about 20 feet from the road's edge, perfectly still in the wash of my headlights. A mannequin, the kind you'd see in a department store window, but wrong somehow. Its pale, featureless face turned toward my approaching car, and one arm was raised, finger pointing down the road ahead. The pose looked natural enough, but something about its positioning felt deliberate, intentional, as if it had been placed there specifically for me. My foot eased off the accelerator. The speedometer dropped from 50 to 40, then 30. I told myself it was just some bizarre roadside decoration, maybe part of an art installation or a prank by local kids. But my heart rate climbed anyway, thumping against my ribs like a caged animal. The mannequin disappeared in my rearview mirror as I rounded the first curve. The road twisted left, then right, following the contours of the hillside. My headlights swept across more trees, more shadows, more empty pavement. Then the second curve revealed another figure. This one stood closer to the road, maybe 15 feet away. Same pale skin, same smooth features, but this mannequin's arm pointed at a 45-degree angle toward what looked like a side road branching off to the right. Its head was tilted slightly, as if studying me as I passed. The pose was different from the first one, more animated, more aware. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead despite the car's heater. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, eager to put distance between myself and whatever game was being played here. The engine responded with a low growl, and the speedometer climbed back toward 50. But the next curve brought a third mannequin, then a fourth, then a fifth. Each one stood in a different position, each arm pointing in a new direction. Some gestured toward side roads I hadn't noticed before, narrow dirt tracks that vanished between the trees. Others seemed to indicate upcoming turns in the main road itself. They formed a chain of silent sentinels, guiding me deeper into the maze of backwoods highways. My breathing grew shallow and quick. The steering wheel felt slick under my sweating palms. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my eyes kept darting to the shoulder, searching for the next figure. They appeared with clockwork regularity, one after every curve, never in quite the same spot, never in quite the same pose. The worst part was how perfect they looked. No weathering, no damage from exposure to the elements. Their clothes, simple white shirts and dark pants, showed no signs of dirt or wear. It was as if they'd been placed there moments before my arrival, positioned by invisible hands that knew exactly which way I'd be traveling. I reached for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. No signal. The screen showed nothing but empty bars, a stark reminder of how isolated this stretch of road really was. I was alone out here with these things, these silent watchers that seemed to multiply with every mile. The road began to climb, winding up the side of what felt like a mountain. My ears popped from the altitude change. The trees grew thicker, their branches reaching across the pavement like gnarled arms trying to snare passing vehicles. Fog began to seep between the trunks, adding another layer of concealment to the already murky landscape. Then I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The next mannequin wasn't just pointing, it was looking at me. Its head had turned to track my movement as I approached, smooth features following my car's progress along the curve. The motion was subtle but unmistakable, a slow rotation that kept its eyeless face aimed directly at my windshield. My foot slammed on the brakes without conscious thought. Tires squealed against wet asphalt as the car lurched to a stop. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat, taste copper on my tongue. The mannequin stood motionless now, arm extended toward a gap in the trees where another road branched away into darkness. I sat there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, engine idling, hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. The figure remained perfectly still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for me to make my choice. Follow its direction, or continue straight ahead into unknown territory. The gas gauge needle had dropped even further into the red zone. Soon I'd be stranded out here regardless of which path I chose. The thought of being trapped on foot among these things sent fresh waves of panic through my system. I had to keep moving, had to find civilization before my fuel ran out completely. I eased off the brake and pressed the accelerator. The car crept forward, past the mannequin and its pointing arm. In my peripheral vision, I caught a glimpse of movement, the figure's head turning to follow my progress, maintaining that invisible connection between us. More curves, more mannequins, each one positioned with surgical precision, each gesture carefully calculated to guide me along a predetermined route. Some pointed left, others right. A few aimed their arms at paths so narrow they barely qualified as roads, little more than tire tracks carved through the underbrush. The pattern became clear after another mile of winding progress. The figures weren't randomly placed. They formed a chain of directions, a silent GPS system made of plastic and cloth. Someone or something wanted me to follow a specific route through this labyrinth of backwoods highways. But why? And who? The questions gnawed at my mind as I navigated another series of curves. My headlights illuminated more mannequins, more pointing arms, more eyeless faces that seemed to track my movement. The fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet in any direction. The world beyond my headlight beams disappeared into gray nothingness. Then I saw something that made my already racing heart skip several beats entirely. Ahead, where the road split into a Y intersection, stood not one but three mannequins. They formed a triangle around the junction, each pointing down a different path. But these weren't like the others I'd passed. These figures wore different clothes: torn jeans, faded t-shirts, scuffed sneakers. Their poses were more casual, more human, and their faces weren't smooth and featureless. They had details: painted eyes, molded noses, parted lips that seemed on the verge of speech. The level of craftsmanship was extraordinary, almost lifelike in its precision. I brought the car to another stop, this time keeping the engine running. My hands trembled as I studied the three figures through the windshield. The one on the left pointed down a road that curved away into deeper forest. The middle figure gestured straight ahead, where the pavement continued but looked rougher, more neglected. The one on the right indicated a path that seemed to climb higher into the hills. As I watched, paralyzed by indecision and growing terror, all three mannequins slowly turned their heads toward my car. The movement was synchronized, deliberate. 6 painted eyes focused on me through the glass. 6 lips curved into identical, subtle smiles. They stood there for a long moment, heads tilted at the same angle, expressions identically welcoming and horrifying. Then they began to move. Not quickly. The motion was glacial, almost imperceptible, but definitely real. Arms shifted position, pointing fingers adjusted their aim. The figure on the left now gestured more urgently toward its chosen path. The middle one's arms swept in a broader arc, encompassing the straight route ahead. The one on the right raised both arms, forming an arrow that pointed unmistakably toward the climbing road. My vision blurred. Sweat poured down my face and back, soaking through my shirt. The car's interior felt like a sauna despite the cool mountain air outside. I blinked hard, trying to clear my sight, desperately hoping the movement had been a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But when my vision cleared, the mannequins had changed position again. Now they stood closer to the road, maybe 10 feet from my front bumper. Their painted eyes reflected my headlights like tiny mirrors, creating an otherworldly glow that seemed to pierce straight through the windshield and into my soul. The gas gauge needle touched the bottom of the red zone. Empty. Or close enough that the distinction didn't matter. I had to choose: left, straight, or right. Each path led into darkness. Each mannequin promised safe passage through its pointing gesture. But safe passage to where? And what would happen if I chose wrong? The figure on the right suddenly raised its other arm, forming a clear, unmistakable gesture toward the climbing road. Its painted smile seemed to widen, though that had to be my imagination. Plastic features couldn't change expression. Could they? My foot found the accelerator almost without conscious decision. The car lurched forward, turning right toward the climbing path. As I passed between the mannequins, I caught glimpses of them in my peripheral vision. Heads turning to track my movement, arms shifting to new positions, smiles that seemed to grow more satisfied with each passing second. The road climbed steeply now, switchbacking up the mountainside in a series of hairpin turns. My engine strained against the grade, transmission downshifting to maintain momentum. The fog grew thicker until I could barely see 10 feet ahead. Tree branches scraped against the car's roof and sides, creating a symphony of scratching sounds that set my teeth on edge. More mannequins appeared along this route, but these were different again. Older somehow, their clothes more weathered, their poses more desperate. Some reached toward the car as if pleading for help. Others pointed not ahead but behind, as if warning me to turn back. A few simply stood with arms at their sides, heads bowed, as if in mourning or defeat. The fuel gauge's warning light had been blinking for the last quarter mile. Soon the engine would sputter and die, leaving me stranded among these silent watchers. The thought sent fresh spikes of panic through my chest. I had to find something: a house, a gas station, any sign of human habitation, before my transportation failed completely. That's when I crested the hill and saw the lights. A cluster of buildings spread across a small plateau, warm yellow windows glowing through the fog like beacons of salvation. A sign at the edge of the settlement read, "Welcome to Millbrook, population 247. Below that, in smaller letters, home of the Millbrook Mannequin Museum, open daily. Relief flooded through me so powerfully I nearly wept. Civilization, people, help. I could refuel here, get directions back to the interstate, put this nightmare behind me. The mannequins lining the road suddenly seemed less threatening, probably just an elaborate advertising campaign for the museum, designed to draw tourists down this forgotten back road. I coasted into the town's main street, past darkened storefronts and empty sidewalks. Most of the buildings looked old but well-maintained, their facades touched with the kind of rustic charm that attracted weekend visitors from the city. A few porch lights illuminated front steps and doorways, but no people moved among the shadows. The only business that appeared open was a combination gas station and general store at the far end of the street. Fluorescent lights buzzed behind grimy windows, and a single pump stood sentinel beside the building. As I pulled up to the pump, my engine gave a final wheeze and died. Perfect timing. I climbed out of the car on legs that felt like rubber, grateful to be standing on solid ground again. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of pine trees and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. Otherwise, the night was perfectly quiet. The gas pump was old, but functional. I slid my credit card through the reader and began filling my tank, watching the numbers climb on the digital display. The fuel flowed steadily, and with each gallon, my confidence returned. Soon I'd be back on the interstate. This strange detour nothing more than an odd story to tell friends over drinks. But as I stood there waiting for the tank to fill, I noticed something that made my newly recovered calm evaporate like morning mist. Across the street, in front of what looked like a small museum, stood a row of mannequins behind a chain-link fence. Even in the dim light, I could see their poses, some pointing down the street, others gesturing toward the museum entrance, a few simply standing with arms at their sides. They looked exactly like the figures I'd encountered on the road, down to their clothing and positioning. My gaze traveled further down the street, picking out more details in the shadows. More mannequins stood in shop windows, their painted faces turned toward the street. Others occupied bus benches and doorways, positioned as if waiting for transportation or friends that would never come. The entire town seemed populated by these silent figures, a community of plastic residents frozen in eternal poses. The gas pump clicked off, startling me back to immediate concerns. My tank was full, my card had been charged, and my car was ready to carry me away from this place. But as I climbed back behind the wheel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by dozens of painted eyes. I started the engine and pulled away from the gas station, eager to find the road that would take me back to the interstate. But as I drove through the town, searching for exit signs or route markers, a disturbing realization began to take shape. Every street I turned down seemed to curve back toward the town center. Every road I followed dead-ended at the same cluster of buildings. And at every intersection, more mannequins stood pointing in directions that led nowhere but deeper into the maze of identical streets. I'd been driving for 20 minutes, following a dozen different routes, and hadn't managed to leave the town limits. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, but I was no closer to escape than when I'd started. If anything, I seemed to be more thoroughly trapped than before. That's when I noticed the change in the mannequins themselves. The ones I'd seen earlier, positioned in shop windows and doorways, had moved. Not dramatically, but noticeably. A figure that had been pointing east now gestured south. Another that had been sitting on a bench now stood beside it, arm extended toward a side street I hadn't noticed before. They were guiding me again, just as they had on the mountain road, leading me through a predetermined pattern of movements, keeping me contained within the boundaries of their domain. But why? What did they want? What was the purpose of this elaborate trap? My heart rate spiked again as the truth began to dawn. This wasn't coincidence or tourism marketing. The mannequins weren't advertisements for a museum. They were the museum. And I wasn't just a visitor who'd stumbled upon their territory. I was the newest exhibit. The car's headlights swept across a familiar intersection, revealing the same trio of mannequins I'd encountered at the Y junction on the mountain road. They stood in identical positions, arms pointing in the same directions, painted smiles unchanged. But now I understood what those smiles meant. They weren't welcoming. They were satisfied. Satisfied that their plan had worked. That another traveler had followed their guidance to exactly where they wanted him to be. I slammed on the brakes and threw the transmission into reverse. The car lurched backward, tires squealing against asphalt. If I couldn't find a road out of town, maybe I could retrace my route back up the mountain, follow the chain of pointing figures in reverse until I reached the interstate. But as I backed around the corner, my headlights illuminated something that stopped my heart entirely. The road I'd driven down, the only road that had brought me into town, was gone. In its place stood a solid wall of trees, trunks packed so tightly together that not even a person could squeeze between them. The pavement simply ended at the tree line, as if the road had been surgically removed from the landscape. I was trapped. Completely, utterly trapped. The mannequins had moved again while I wasn't looking. Now they formed a loose circle around my car, dozens of plastic figures converging from all directions. Their painted eyes reflected my headlights, creating a constellation of tiny stars in the darkness. Their smiles seemed wider now, more satisfied, as if they were celebrating the success of their hunt. But they weren't moving to attack or threaten me. They simply stood there, watching and waiting, patient as only the inanimate could be patient, content to let time do what violence couldn't. I understood then that this was their nature, not malevolent in any traditional sense, but completely alien in their motivations. They collected travelers, guided them to this place through an elaborate system of misdirection and false choices. But they didn't harm their catches. They simply kept them. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, a strange calm settled over my mind. The panic that had driven me for the last hour began to fade, replaced by a curious sense of acceptance. Fighting wouldn't help. Rage wouldn't change anything. The mannequins had won through patience and planning, and now they would add me to their collection. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car one final time. The mannequins watched but didn't move as I walked to the center of their circle. Up close, I could see the incredible detail in their construction. Every fold of clothing, every subtle expression line, every tiny imperfection that made them seem almost human. Almost, but not quite. And as I stood there among them, feeling their painted gazes on my skin, I began to understand what they were really collecting. Not people themselves, but something deeper, something that had to be given willingly, not taken by force. The choice was mine. I could resist, fight against the inevitable, and eventually succumb to exhaustion and despair. Or I could join them willingly, become part of their silent community, add my own guidance to the chain that would lead other travelers to this same moment of decision. The mannequins waited, patient as stone, while I made my choice. When dawn broke over Millbrook, the town looked exactly as it had for decades. The same mannequins stood in their appointed places, arms pointing down streets that led nowhere and everywhere. The same painted smiles welcomed visitors who would never leave. But now there was one more figure among them, a newcomer positioned at the gas station, arm extended toward the mountain road. His pose was natural, his expression peaceful, his painted eyes reflecting the morning light with the patient satisfaction of those who had finally found their purpose. And when the next lost traveler found the unmarked exit ramp, when their fuel ran low and their GPS failed, he would be there to point the way, just as the others had pointed the way for him. The collection was complete. The circle closed, the pattern ready to begin again. Story 6. The old brick walls of Millbrook Academy breathed with a century's worth of secrets, and tonight they seemed to exhale something particularly cold against my neck. I'd been the night security guard here for 3 months, long enough to know that this place held more than dusty textbooks and forgotten homework assignments. The building groaned with age, its wooden floors settling into positions they'd held since 1923, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the silence carried weight. My flashlight cut through the darkness of the main hallway, the beam catching dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the air. The usual sounds were there, the hum of old fluorescent lights that never quite turned off, the distant whisper of wind through poorly sealed windows, the occasional crack of settling timber. But underneath it all, there was something else. Something that made the hair on my forearms stand at attention. I'd always been sensitive to atmosphere. My ex-wife used to mock me for it, telling people at parties how I'd refuse to go into certain rooms of houses we were looking to buy, claiming they felt wrong. She thought it was nonsense. Maybe it was. But 3 months of walking these halls had taught me that Millbrook Academy definitely felt wrong. The headmaster had mentioned the service tunnels during my orientation, describing them as part of the old heating system that connected the main building to the gymnasium and cafeteria. He'd been casual about it, almost dismissive, but something in his eyes suggested he'd rather I stayed out of them. Of course, that only made me more curious. Tonight, with the autumn wind rattling windows and my nerves already on edge, I decided it was time to explore those tunnels. The access door was tucked away in the basement behind the boiler room, secured with a lock that looked newer than anything else down there. The key hung on my security ring, labeled simply as ST in faded black ink. The basement air was thick and stagnant, carrying the metallic taste of old pipes and concrete. My footsteps echoed differently down here, absorbed and muffled by the low ceiling and narrow walls. When I reached the service tunnel door, my hand hesitated on the key. Something deep in my gut was telling me to turn around, go back upstairs, finish my rounds in the familiar territory of classrooms and corridors. Instead, I turned the key. The door opened with a reluctant squeal, revealing a narrow passage that disappeared into absolute darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. Cool air rushed out, carrying with it a smell I couldn't quite identify. Not decay, exactly, but something organic and old. The tunnel walls were rough concrete, streaked with mineral deposits that looked like frozen tears in my flashlight beam. I stepped inside, and my breathing immediately became more labored. The space was tighter than I'd expected, barely wide enough for my shoulders. The ceiling hung low enough that I had to duck slightly as I moved forward. Each step produced a hollow sound that seemed to travel much farther than it should have. About 20 feet in, I stopped to orient myself. According to the building schematics I'd memorized, this tunnel should run straight for about 100 yards before branching off toward the other buildings. Simple enough. But standing there in the oppressive darkness, with only my flashlight beam for company, I felt anything but confident. That's when I heard it the first time. Clap. The sound came from behind me, back toward the door I'd entered through. I spun around, my light sweeping across empty concrete walls. The tunnel stretched back the way I'd come, completely vacant. My heart rate kicked up a notch. I waited, listening intently, but heard only the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of machinery somewhere in the building above. I continued forward, telling myself it had been nothing, maybe something falling in the boiler room, or the old building settling. But my palms were already beginning to sweat, making the flashlight slippery in my grip. The tunnel continued straight, just as the blueprints had indicated. My footsteps fell into a steady rhythm, and I began to relax slightly. This was just another part of the building to patrol, nothing more mysterious than that. Clap, clap. I froze mid-step. This time the sound was definitely behind me, and definitely the sound of hands striking together. Twice, deliberately, with a hollow echo that seemed to multiply as it bounced off the tunnel walls. I turned around slowly, my flashlight beam trembling slightly as my hands began to shake. The tunnel behind me was empty, stretching back into darkness beyond my light's reach. But the echo of those claps seemed to hang in the air, reverberating long after they should have faded. My throat felt dry. I swallowed hard, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. There had to be an explanation. Maybe someone else was in the building, though that seemed impossible since I'd done my initial sweep and locked all the entrances myself. Maybe the sound was traveling from somewhere else, distorted by the building's acoustics. I forced myself to continue forward, but every muscle in my body was tense now. My breathing had become shallow and rapid, and I could feel sweat beginning to gather at the base of my neck despite the cool air. The tunnel seemed to stretch on longer than it should have. According to my estimate, I should have reached the first junction by now, but the passage continued straight ahead with no sign of branching. I checked my watch. I'd been walking for nearly 10 minutes, which should have taken me well past the gymnasium connection point. Clap, clap, clap. This time the sound was closer, and it didn't come from behind me. It came from ahead, somewhere in the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. 3 distinct claps, each one seeming to echo and multiply until it sounded like a dozen pairs of hands applauding in the darkness. My legs felt weak. I pressed my back against the tunnel wall, the rough concrete catching on my uniform shirt. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my breathing had become ragged and uneven. The echoes faded, but in the silence that followed, I became acutely aware that I was no longer alone in these tunnels. Something was ahead of me in the darkness, something that knew I was there. I considered turning back, but the thought of walking toward whatever might be behind me seemed even worse than continuing forward. At least ahead I could see where I was going. Behind me lay only uncertainty and the growing conviction that something was following my trail. I pushed forward, my flashlight beam dancing nervously across the walls. Every shadow seemed to move. Every irregularity in the concrete looked like it might be hiding something. The air felt thicker now, almost viscous, and each breath seemed to require more effort than the last. Clap, 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 clap. 4 claps this time, coming from multiple directions. The sound bounced off the walls in a complex pattern of echoes that made it impossible to determine the source. But what chilled me to the bone was the rhythm. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, measured, almost musical in its timing. As the echoes faded, I heard something else. Something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The sound of multiple voices, faint and distant, humming a tune I didn't recognize. The melody was simple, childlike, but distorted by the tunnel acoustics until it became something alien and threatening. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the space around me with an unnatural harmony. I realized I was hyperventilating. My vision began to blur at the edges, and I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. The concrete felt cold and clammy against my palm, like dead skin. The humming continued, growing gradually louder. Not closer necessarily, but more intense, as if more voices were joining the ghostly choir. The melody was hypnotic, almost compelling, and I found myself listening despite every instinct screaming at me to run. Then, without warning, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. Even my own breathing seemed muted, as if the air itself had thickened to muffle all sound. I stood perfectly still, straining to hear anything that might give me a clue about what was happening. Clap. A single clap, so close I felt the air displacement against my face. I jerked backward, my flashlight beam swinging wildly, but illuminated nothing except empty tunnel walls. My nerve finally broke. I turned and ran back the way I'd come, my footsteps pounding against the concrete floor in a frantic rhythm. Behind me, the clapping started again, slow at first, then building in tempo and volume until it sounded like an entire auditorium erupting in applause. The sound followed me, seeming to gain on me with each step I took. The tunnel seemed endless now. I ran and ran, my lungs burning and my legs growing weak, but the exit door never appeared. The clapping continued behind me, joined once again by that haunting, childlike humming that echoed and multiplied until it became a cacophony of supernatural voices. Just when I thought I might collapse from exhaustion and terror, my flashlight beam caught the familiar outline of the service door. I practically threw myself against it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The lock finally gave way, and I tumbled out into the basement, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against the closed door, gasping for breath, my entire body drenched in cold sweat. The basement felt warm and welcoming compared to the nightmare I just escaped. But as my breathing began to return to normal, I noticed something that made my blood run cold once again. The sound was still there, faint but unmistakable, coming through the heavy door. The clapping and humming continued in that underground space, as if whatever presence I'd encountered was still performing for an audience I couldn't see. I backed away from the door, my legs unsteady, and made my way upstairs to the main floor. The familiar hallways of the school felt like sanctuary after the claustrophobic horror of the tunnels. I completed my rounds mechanically, checking doors and windows with trembling hands, trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced had been some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and the oppressive atmosphere of the underground passage. But when I returned to the basement an hour later to check the boiler room, I could still hear it. Fainter now, but definitely there. The rhythmic clapping and that ethereal, ghostly humming seeping through the service door like water through stone. I never went back into those tunnels. I finished out my shift that night and submitted my resignation the next morning, citing personal reasons. The headmaster seemed unsurprised by my decision, almost as if he'd been expecting it. As I cleaned out my security office, I found a folder tucked away in the back of a file cabinet. It contained resignation letters from the previous 4 night security guards, all submitted after similar brief tenures. None of them had given specific reasons for leaving, but reading between the lines, I could sense the same underlying anxiety that had driven me away. The last letter in the file was from my immediate predecessor, a man named Henderson who'd lasted only 6 weeks on the job. His resignation was brief and professional, but there was a handwritten note paper clipped to it that made my hands shake as I read it. The children in the tunnels won't stop their games. They want someone to play with them, but I can't. I won't. Some performances are better left unwitnessed. I put the folder back where I'd found it and walked away from Millbrook Academy for the last time. But even now, months later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear the distant sound of clapping hands and ethereal voices humming their haunting melody. And I know with absolute certainty that somewhere beneath that century-old building, the performance continues, waiting patiently for the next night guard curious enough to venture into the darkness and discover what secrets the tunnels hold. The echoes never truly fade. They just wait in the darkness, marking time with their endless hollow applause. Story 7. Some nights refuse to end the way they began. This was one of those nights. The kind that starts with hope and ends with something crawling under your skin. Something that makes you question whether the darkness outside is worse than the darkness within your own mind. The rejection had stung more than I cared to admit. Her laugh, not cruel, just indifferent, still echoed in my ears as I stumbled out of Murphy's bar into the cold October air. The alcohol had done its job too well, turning my legs to rubber and my thoughts to molasses. Each step on the cracked sidewalk felt like walking through quicksand, my body swaying with the rhythm of someone who'd had 3 drinks too many. The city looked different at this hour. Streetlights cast long, skeletal shadows that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. The usual late-night traffic had dwindled to nothing, leaving me alone with the sound of my own footsteps echoing off empty storefronts and darkened windows. Even the homeless guy who usually camped near the corner was nowhere to be seen. I fumbled for my phone to check the time, but the screen remained black, despite repeated attempts to wake it. Dead battery. Perfect. My watch had stopped working months ago, leaving me in that disorienting temporal void that accompanies deep intoxication. Time stretched and contracted like taffy, making the 6-block walk home feel both endless and instantaneous. The first streetlight flickered as I passed beneath it. Nothing unusual there. The city's infrastructure was falling apart, and flickering lights were as common as potholes. But something made me glance back, and I watched as the light gave one final sputter before dying completely, plunging that section of sidewalk into darkness. My pace quickened despite my unsteady legs. The alcohol was starting to wear off, replaced by a different kind of disorientation. The creeping awareness that something wasn't quite right. The air felt thicker somehow, pressing against my skin like invisible fingers. Each breath required more effort than the last, as if the oxygen itself was being slowly drained from the night. That's when I heard it. David. The voice came from inside my head, not through my ears, a whisper so soft it might have been my imagination, yet so clear it made my spine straighten and my scalp prickle with electricity. It was distinctly feminine, with a quality that reminded me of silk being torn. Beautiful and violent at the same time. I stopped walking and looked around, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. The street was empty, just as it had been moments before. No windows were open in the surrounding buildings. No one was hiding in doorways or behind parked cars. The voice had come from nowhere and everywhere at once. David. There it was again, clearer this time. My name spoken with an intimacy that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the voice of the woman from the bar. This was something else entirely. Something that knew me in a way that felt violating, as if it had been watching me for far longer than just tonight. The second streetlight died as I passed beneath it. This time I was looking up when it happened, watching the bulb flicker once, twice, then extinguish with a sound like a sigh. The darkness seemed to flow outward from the dead light, spreading across the sidewalk like spilled ink. Behind me, I could still see the warm glow of Murphy's bar, but ahead, the street was becoming a tunnel of shadows. My legs felt stronger now, adrenaline burning away the last vestiges of alcohol. I picked up my pace, my footsteps echoing strangely in the empty air. Each echo seemed to linger too long, as if the sound was being stretched and distorted by invisible hands. Sometimes I thought I could hear an extra set of footsteps mixed in with mine, but whenever I stopped to listen, there was only silence. David, don't run from me. The voice was closer now, more intimate. It felt like someone whispering directly into my ear, their breath warm against my skin. I spun around, nearly losing my balance, but the street behind me was empty. Just the growing line of dead streetlights marking my path like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. My breathing became shallow and rapid. Each inhalation felt insufficient, as if the air had been replaced with something thinner and more hostile. Sweat broke out across my forehead despite the cold, and my hands began to shake. The familiar weight of panic settled in my chest like a stone. The third light went out just as I reached it. Now I was walking through near complete darkness, with only the faint glow of distant windows to guide me. The shadows seemed alive, shifting and reaching whenever I glanced at them peripherally. Garbage cans became crouching figures. Fire hydrants transformed into waiting predators. Every familiar landmark of my daily commute had been twisted into something threatening and alien. I've been waiting for you, David. This time the voice carried emotion, longing mixed with something darker. It spoke my name like a prayer and a curse combined. My throat felt dry as sandpaper, and I tried to swallow, but found no saliva. The taste of fear was metallic on my tongue, sharp and bitter. I broke into a stumbling run. The fourth light died as I approached it, then the fifth, then the sixth. Each extinguished bulb added to the growing pool of darkness that seemed to follow me like a living thing. Behind me, I could hear something that might have been laughter, soft, musical, and completely devoid of warmth. My apartment building finally came into view, a blessed rectangle of light in the consuming darkness. The lobby was illuminated, and I could see the familiar figure of the night security guard through the glass doors. Normal, blessed normalcy just 50 yards away. Almost home, David. Almost safe. The voice now carried a mocking tone that made my skin crawl. It was as if the speaker found my desperate flight amusing, like a cat watching a mouse scurry toward a hole that might not offer the sanctuary it promised. The seventh light went out. I was running in earnest now, my breath coming in ragged gasps that created small clouds in the cold air. My legs felt like water, but terror gave them strength. The entrance to my building seemed to grow more distant with each step, as if I were running through one of those nightmares where the goal recedes no matter how fast you move. You can't escape what's inside you, David. The words hit me like a physical blow, stopping me mid-stride. What did that mean? What was inside me? I looked down at my hands and saw they were shaking uncontrollably. My reflection in a nearby storefront window showed a man I barely recognized. Wild-eyed, pale, with the look of someone who had seen too much. The eighth light flickered and died. I was close enough now to see the security guard reading a newspaper, completely oblivious to the supernatural darkness consuming the street outside. He looked so normal, so mundane, that I almost cried with relief. Whatever was happening to me would end once I reached that island of artificial light and human presence. Look at you, David, running from shadows, running from yourself. The voice was right beside me now, as if someone was walking next to me step for step. I could almost feel the presence, a cold emptiness that moved with predatory grace. My peripheral vision caught glimpses of something pale and fluid, but whenever I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. The ninth light died just as I reached the final stretch to my building. I fumbled for my keys with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The simple act of finding the right key became an impossible task as my fingers refused to cooperate. Behind me, I could feel something approaching. Not footsteps, but a presence that made the air itself feel heavier. David. The voice was no longer inside my head. It came from directly behind me, spoken aloud by lips that shouldn't exist. The sound was wet and urgent, like someone speaking through a mouthful of water. I didn't turn around. I couldn't turn around. Instead, I threw myself against the glass doors of the lobby, pounding on them until the security guard looked up from his newspaper with a startled expression. He moved toward the door with agonizing slowness, his keys jangling as he approached. The final street light, the one directly in front of my building, began to flicker. I'm not going anywhere, David. I'm part of you now. The guard reached the door and began to unlock it, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was asking me something, but I couldn't hear his words over the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. The lock clicked open just as the last light died, plunging the entire street into absolute darkness. I burst through the door and stumbled into the lobby, gasping and shaking. The security guard grabbed my arm to steady me, his face creased with concern. He was asking if I was all right, if I needed him to call someone, but his voice sounded distant and muffled. Behind me, through the glass doors, the street was completely black. Not even the moon seemed to penetrate the unnatural darkness that had followed me home. But as I stared into that void, I began to see shapes moving within it, pale, fluid forms that seemed to dance and writhe in patterns that hurt to look at. I'm still here, David. I'll always be here. The voice came from inside the lobby now, inside my head, inside me. The security guard was still talking, but I could barely focus on his words. My reflection in the glass doors showed something that made my blood freeze. Standing behind me, translucent and shifting like smoke, was the outline of a woman. Her face was indistinct, but her eyes were dark holes that seemed to pull at something deep within my chest. I blinked, and she was gone. The guard was still there, solid and real, asking if I wanted him to call the police. The lobby was bright and normal, filled with the comfortable hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic from the main street. But when I looked back at the glass doors, my reflection showed only myself. Alone, shaking, with eyes that had seen too much. The streetlights outside were beginning to flicker back to life, one by one, as if someone was walking back the way I had come, restoring illumination to chase away the darkness. Until tomorrow night, David. The voice was fading now, becoming just another whisper among the ambient sounds of the city. But I knew it would return. Whatever had found me on that dark street wasn't finished with me. It had followed me home, had made itself known, and now it lived somewhere in the space between my thoughts and fears. I thanked the security guard and made my way to the elevator, my legs still unsteady but no longer from alcohol. As the doors closed and I began my ascent to the 14th floor, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished metal. For just a moment, I thought I saw someone else standing behind me. But when I turned around, the elevator was empty. The doors opened onto my floor, and I walked down the familiar hallway to my apartment. Everything was exactly as I had left it hours earlier, when the biggest concern in my life had been working up the courage to talk to a woman in a bar. Now, as I turned my key in the lock, I realized that some rejections are mercies in disguise. Inside my apartment, I went immediately to the window that faced the street. All the lights were working again, casting their usual warm glow over empty sidewalks and parked cars. The street looked completely normal, as if the darkness that had swallowed it just minutes before had never existed. But as I watched, a figure emerged from the shadows across the street. Tall, pale, and distinctly feminine, She stood beneath one of the streetlights and looked up at my window. Even from 14 floors up, I could feel her eyes on me, dark, patient, and utterly inhuman. She raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a promise, then stepped backward into the shadows and disappeared. I closed the curtains and double-locked my door, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever had found me tonight lived in a place where locks and curtains offered no protection. It had made its home in the space between reality and nightmare, and it would be waiting for me every time the sun went down. "See you tomorrow night, David." The voice was just a whisper now, barely distinguishable from the sound of my own breathing. But I heard it clearly, and I knew that my nights of walking home alone were over. From now on, I would always have company, the kind that cast no shadow and left no footprints, but followed nonetheless. I poured myself a drink with hands that finally stopped shaking and settled into my chair to wait for dawn. Outside, the city continued its nightly dance of light and shadow, oblivious to the fact that something new had been born in its dark corners. Something that knew my name and had all the time in the world to make me understand exactly what that meant. The story 8. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, testing leak detection systems for 8 hours straight can mess with anyone's mind. The repetitive beeping, the sterile fluorescent lighting of the basement laboratory, the chemical smell that seemed to seep through every surface. It was enough to make even the most rational person start hearing things. But the scent of burning candles was too distinct, too real, and that whispered word, delivered with such intimate proximity to my ear that I could feel the warmth of breath against my skin, made every hair on my body stand on end. Congratulations. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been working as a safety systems technician for Meridian Industries for the past 3 years. It's not glamorous work, mostly involving testing gas leak detectors, smoke alarms, and various other warning systems that most people never think about until they malfunction. The pay is decent, the hours are regular, and the work environment is quiet. Too quiet, as I was beginning to discover. The company's main testing facility is located in the sub-basement of a 40-year-old office building downtown. Concrete walls painted an institutional beige, exposed ceiling pipes that occasionally drip condensation, and the constant hum of ventilation systems that never quite manage to eliminate the musty smell of decades-old dampness. It's the kind of place where sound travels in strange ways, where you can hear footsteps from floors above echoing through the ductwork, where the building's settling creates groans and creaks that make you look over your shoulder, even when you know you're alone. The testing protocol is straightforward. I work through a checklist of different alarm systems, triggering each one with controlled gas releases or synthetic smoke, recording response times, decibel levels, and ensuring all components function within acceptable parameters. Each test generates a sharp, penetrating beep that cuts through the ambient noise of the facility. Over the course of a typical day, I might hear that sound hundreds of times. It was during my 4th week on a particularly intensive project, testing a new line of methane detectors destined for industrial kitchens, that the first incident occurred. I had just activated alarm unit number 47 when the familiar electronic chirp filled the air. Standard procedure dictated that I wait 15 seconds, record the sound level, then reset the device. But as the beep faded, something else filled the silence. The unmistakable aroma of melted wax and burning wick, sweet and warm, completely at odds with the sterile chemical environment of the lab. My heart rate spiked immediately. The scent was so vivid, so present, that I instinctively looked around for its source. There were no candles in the facility. Open flames were strictly prohibited in a space where we regularly handled combustible gases. The ventilation system wouldn't allow external odors to penetrate the sealed environment, yet the smell persisted, growing stronger rather than dissipating. Then came the voice. Congratulations. The word was delivered directly into my right ear, spoken in a tone that was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It carried the weight of genuine warmth, as if someone truly proud of my achievement was offering heartfelt praise. But there was no one within 10 feet of me, no one else in the entire basement, according to the security logs I had signed when entering that morning. My hands began to shake as I fumbled with the testing equipment. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool temperature maintained throughout the facility. I spun around, scanning every corner of the room, checking behind equipment racks and testing stations. The space was empty except for me and the humming machinery. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Auditory hallucinations brought on by fatigue. Olfactory confusion caused by prolonged exposure to testing chemicals. Stress-induced sensory distortions. I had been working long hours lately, staying late to meet project deadlines. Perhaps my brain was simply processing familiar stimuli in unusual ways. I completed the remaining tests for that day with mechanical precision, forcing myself to focus on the data, the procedures, the concrete reality of electronic circuits and calibrated instruments. But every time an alarm sounded, I found myself tensing, waiting, anticipating that sweet candle scent, and whispered congratulations that never came again that day. 3 days passed without incident. I began to relax, attributing the experience to a combination of exhaustion and the isolated nature of my work environment. I even managed to laugh about it during lunch with my supervisor, describing it as a particularly vivid daydream brought on by too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But on Thursday morning, as I began testing a new batch of carbon monoxide detectors, it happened again. The alarm's shrill warning cut through the air, and immediately the laboratory filled with the scent of vanilla candles. Not just the harsh artificial vanilla of commercial air fresheners, but the rich, complex sweetness of real vanilla beans burning in quality wax. The aroma was so intense that I could taste it on my tongue, feel it coating the inside of my nostrils. My breathing became shallow and rapid. Cold perspiration broke out across my back and under my arms. I gripped the testing console with both hands, knuckles white, waiting for what I knew would come next. Congratulations. This time the voice seemed to linger longer, the word drawn out with what sounded almost like affection. And this time, I was certain I felt the actual warmth of someone's breath against my ear, followed by the faintest sensation of air movement as if someone had just stepped away from me. I spun around so quickly that I knocked over a stack of testing reports, papers scattering across the concrete floor. The laboratory stretched empty in all directions, fluorescent lights humming overhead, ventilation fans cycling air through metal ducts. No hiding places, no shadows deep enough to conceal a person, no possible explanation for what I had experienced. My throat felt dry and constricted. I walked to the water cooler in the corner of the room, hands trembling as I filled a paper cup and drank deeply. The cool liquid helped calm the burning sensation in my chest, but did nothing to erase the memory of that whispered congratulations, or the lingering sweetness of candle wax that seemed to have settled permanently in my sinuses. Over the following week, the incidents became more frequent and more intense. Every single time I triggered an alarm, without exception, the phantom candle scent would fill the air and that voice would offer its mysterious congratulations. I began to dread the sound of the testing equipment, my muscles tensing involuntarily each time I reached for an activation switch. The sensations grew more elaborate as well. What began as a simple scent and whispered word evolved into a full sensory experience. I would smell not just vanilla, but birthday cake candles, the cheap, colorful ones that come in plastic packages at grocery stores. Sometimes the aroma carried hints of chocolate frosting or strawberry ice cream, as if I were standing in the middle of a children's birthday party. The voice, too, became more complex. Instead of a single word, I began to hear what sounded like multiple voices, all offering congratulations in overlapping whispers. Men, women, voices of various ages, all speaking in unison but slightly out of sync, creating an unsettling chorus of praise that seemed to emanate from every direction at once. Physical sensations accompanied these episodes. I would feel hands patting my shoulders, gentle touches on my back, the kind of congratulatory contact you might receive after winning an award or completing a difficult task. But when I looked down, there were never any visible hands touching me. When I reached up to my shoulders, I found nothing but empty air. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in bed, replaying each incident, analyzing every detail, searching for rational explanations that continued to elude me. During the day, I found myself jumping at unexpected sounds, constantly glancing over my shoulder, feeling as though I was being watched, even when security cameras confirmed I was completely alone in the facility. My work performance began to suffer. Simple tasks that I had previously completed without thought now required tremendous concentration. I would catch myself staring at alarm devices before testing them, anticipating the coming sensory assault, building up courage to proceed. Several times I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face and practice deep breathing exercises before returning to complete my assignments. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in my 6th week on the project. I had arrived early, hoping to complete my testing quota before other technicians arrived and potentially witnessed whatever was happening to me. The building felt especially oppressive that day, with an unusual quality to the air that made every breath feel thick and heavy. I began with a batch of propane leak detectors, working through the standard activation sequence. The first alarm triggered, and immediately the laboratory filled with the most intense candle fragrance I had yet experienced. Not just vanilla or birthday cake, but what smelled like an entire room full of lit candles, dozens of different scents blending together in an overwhelming olfactory symphony. The congratulations came not as whispers, but as what sounded like applause. Dozens of hands clapping enthusiastically, accompanied by voices cheering and celebrating. The sound seemed to come from above me, as if I were standing beneath a balcony full of spectators offering their approval. But it was what I saw that finally shattered my remaining composure. As the phantom applause filled the air around me, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. Turning slowly, afraid of what I might discover, I saw them, shadowy figures standing throughout the laboratory, dozens of indistinct human shapes positioned among the equipment racks and testing stations. They were clapping silently, their movements creating no sound, despite the auditory celebration I could hear so clearly. The figures had no distinct features, no faces, no clothing details, just dark human silhouettes that seemed to absorb the fluorescent lighting around them. But their posture conveyed unmistakable approval, heads nodding, hands applauding, bodies swaying slightly, as if moved by genuine appreciation. My vision began to blur at the edges. The room seemed to tilt and spin, and I had to grab the testing console to prevent myself from falling. My heart pounded so violently that I could feel it in my throat, in my temples, in the tips of my fingers. Nausea rose in waves, accompanied by a sensation of complete disconnection from reality. I closed my eyes tightly, pressing my palms against my eyelids until I saw stars. When I opened them again, the laboratory was empty. The applause had stopped. Even the candle scent had faded, leaving only the familiar chemical odors of the testing facility. But the memory of those watching figures remained burned into my consciousness, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was happening to me was far beyond simple hallucination or stress-induced sensory distortion. I spent the rest of that day researching the history of the building, searching through public records, newspaper archives, and city planning documents. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Before becoming an office building, the structure had housed a community center that was particularly famous for hosting children's birthday parties and celebrations. The basement level, now our testing facility, had been the main party room, decorated with colorful balloons and streamers, filled with the laughter and excitement of countless celebrations over the decades. The community center had closed in the early 1980s due to budget constraints, and the building had been converted to office space. But for nearly 30 years before that closure, the basement had been a place of joy, achievement, and congratulation. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of birthday parties, graduation celebrations, award ceremonies, and other milestone events had taken place exactly where I now spent my days testing alarm systems. The revelation should have been comforting, an explanation for the phantom celebrations, the congratulatory voices, the scent of birthday candles. But instead, it filled me with a deeper dread, because I realized that whatever intelligence was manifesting in that basement wasn't malevolent or threatening. It was genuinely trying to celebrate with me, to acknowledge what it perceived as achievements worthy of recognition. Every time I successfully triggered an alarm, completed a test, recorded data in my logs, these residual spirits or psychic impressions were offering their enthusiastic approval. They saw my work as something to be celebrated, and they were expressing that appreciation in the only way they knew how, with the familiar rituals of congratulation and praise that had once filled their former home. Understanding the source of the phenomena didn't make them any less terrifying to experience. If anything, knowing that I was somehow connecting with the accumulated emotional energy of decades of celebrations made each incident feel more intense, more personal. The congratulations weren't random events. They were directed specifically at me, responding to my actions, acknowledging my presence. I considered requesting a transfer to a different facility, but something held me back. Perhaps it was professional pride, or simple curiosity about how far these manifestations might develop. Or perhaps it was the growing realization that, despite my fear, there was something oddly comforting about being acknowledged, even by invisible observers from another time. I began to approach my work differently, accepting that each alarm test would trigger its supernatural celebration. I stopped fighting the fear, and instead tried to observe the phenomena with scientific detachment. I noted patterns in the scents: vanilla on Mondays, chocolate on Wednesdays, mixed fragrances on Fridays. I documented variations in the congratulatory voices, identifying what seemed to be recurring personalities among the phantom celebrants. Most significantly, I started responding to their acknowledgments. When the applause began, I would nod in recognition. When the voices offered their congratulations, I would whisper my thanks. It felt absurd, but it also felt respectful, a way of honoring whatever remained of all those joyful celebrations that had once filled this space. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely, a strange but manageable routine of supernatural recognition for mundane technical work. But 3 months into my modified approach, something changed. I was testing a particularly sensitive smoke detector when the familiar sequence began: candle scent, applause, congratulations. But this time, as I nodded my acknowledgement to the invisible audience, one of the shadowy figures stepped forward from the group. Unlike the others, this figure seemed more substantial, more present. It approached my workstation slowly, deliberately, until it stood directly in front of me. Though it had no distinct facial features, I could sense it looking at me with what felt like curiosity or concern. Then it reached out what appeared to be a hand and touched the alarm device I had just tested. The moment of contact sent a shock of understanding through my consciousness. I suddenly comprehended that these weren't merely residual memories or psychic impressions. They were aware entities, capable of observation and response, and they had been trying to communicate something far more important than simple congratulations. The alarms I was testing, the safety systems I was calibrating, they recognized their purpose. These spirits understood that my work was about protection, about preventing harm, about ensuring that warnings would sound when danger approached. Their congratulations weren't just acknowledgement of technical competence. They were gratitude for my contribution to safety and security. In that instant of connection, I felt a profound sense of purpose that I had never experienced in my work before. Every alarm I tested might someday save a life. Every calibration I performed might prevent a tragedy. And somehow, the accumulated spirits of celebration in this basement recognized and appreciated that vital function. The revelation transformed my relationship with both my work and the supernatural manifestations that accompanied it. What had once terrified me now felt like a sacred partnership. I was the living technician ensuring that safety systems functioned properly, while they were the eternal witnesses acknowledging the importance of that mission. I continued my testing with renewed dedication, approaching each alarm activation as both a technical procedure and a ceremony worth celebrating. The phantom congratulations became a source of motivation rather than fear, reminding me that my seemingly mundane work served a higher purpose. The scent of candles still fills the air each time an alarm sounds. The voices still whisper their congratulations. The shadowy figures still applaud my efforts. But now I understand that I'm not alone in that basement laboratory. I'm part of a community that spans decades, connected by a shared appreciation for life's achievements, whether they're birthday milestones or the simple completion of tasks that keep people safe. Every morning, as I descend into that basement and prepare for another day of testing, I'm greeted by the patient presence of invisible observers who have been waiting to celebrate whatever small victories the day might bring. And every evening, as I pack up my equipment and prepare to leave, I offer my own quiet thanks to the spirits who have taught me that every accomplishment, no matter how routine it might seem, deserves recognition and appreciation. The congratulations continue, and I've learned to accept them as the gift they were always meant to be. Story 9. The fluorescent lights above cast their sickly yellow glow across empty tables, chairs stacked like skeletal fingers reaching toward the stained ceiling. The familiar ritual of closing time had become my anchor in a world that seemed increasingly unstable, each night bringing me closer to something I couldn't name, but felt pressing against the edges of my consciousness like a weight behind my eyes. I moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency, wiping down surfaces that already gleamed, straightening salt shakers that stood in perfect formation. The silence pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical presence, broken only by the distant hum of the walk-in cooler and the occasional creak of the building settling into darkness. My footsteps echoed hollow and strange, as if the restaurant had grown larger in the emptiness, stretching beyond its familiar boundaries. The cash register's final tally had been completed 20 minutes ago. Every customer had paid their bill and departed into the October night, leaving behind only the lingering scent of fried food and the ghost warmth of bodies that had filled the space hours before. I had watched the last patron leave through the front door, the chime announcing their departure with its cheerful mockery of the unease that had been building in my chest throughout the evening. Something felt different tonight, though I couldn't articulate what had changed. The air seemed thicker, more resistant to movement, as if invisible threads were beginning to weave themselves through the familiar space. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the light switches, and I blamed it on fatigue, on the long shift that had stretched from early afternoon into the deep night hours. But as I moved toward the main dining room controls, my peripheral vision caught movement near the back corner. Table 20 sat in the shadows where the overhead lights created pools of darkness between their reach. A figure occupied the chair facing away from me, hunched slightly forward with arms positioned as if leaning on the surface before him. My heart began its urgent rhythm against my ribs as I processed what I was seeing. The man appeared elderly, his hair a silver gray that caught what little light filtered into that corner. His shoulders moved in a gentle, repetitive motion, and I realized he was wiping his forehead with what looked like a napkin or handkerchief. Steam or vapor seemed to rise from around him, creating a hazy distortion in the air that made my eyes water when I tried to focus. Every rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible. I had checked every table, every booth, every corner of the restaurant during my closing routine. The front door had been locked for over an hour, the back entrance secured since we stopped receiving deliveries at 6. No one could have entered without triggering the electronic chime system that announced every opening and closing. My throat constricted as I tried to call out, to ask how he had gotten in, to demand an explanation for his presence in my locked restaurant, but my voice emerged as barely a whisper, lost in the oppressive silence that seemed to absorb sound like a hungry mouth. The fluorescent lights buzzed with increasing intensity, their electrical hum becoming almost musical in its rising and falling pitch. I forced my legs to carry me closer, though every instinct screamed warnings through my nervous system. The man continued his methodical wiping motion, completely unaware of my approach or choosing to ignore it entirely. The vapor around him grew more pronounced as I drew near, and I caught the distinct scent of something medicinal, sharp, and clinical, like the antiseptic smell that clings to hospital corridors. My palms were slick with perspiration as I reached for the wall switch that controlled the dining room's main lighting array. The simple act of lifting my arm felt like moving through molasses, resistance building with each inch of elevation. The switch seemed impossibly far away, though I knew it sat exactly where it had for the past 3 years I had worked here. The click of the switch echoed through the space with unnatural volume, and brilliant white light flooded the dining room, banishing shadows and revealing every corner in harsh detail. I blinked against the sudden brightness, my eyes streaming tears as they adjusted to the illumination. Table 20 stood empty. The chair where the man had been sitting remained pushed back from the table, as if recently vacated. But no human form occupied the space, No elderly figure with gray hair and methodical movements. Instead, wisps of vapor hung in the air where he had been, slowly dissipating like the last breath released from dying lungs. My knees buckled slightly, and I gripped the edge of a nearby table to steady myself. The logical explanations crowded my mind, each one falling apart under scrutiny. Hallucination brought on by exhaustion seemed most reasonable, yet the physical evidence of the pushed-back chair and the lingering vapor contradicted that theory. The medicinal smell persisted, growing stronger rather than fading, as if whatever had been there was becoming more present rather than less. I approached table 20 with the careful steps of someone navigating a minefield. The surface appeared normal under the harsh lighting, its laminated wood grain showing the usual scuffs and water rings accumulated over years of service. But as I leaned closer, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with renewed fear. The table's surface was warm. Not just warm, but hot enough that I could feel the heat radiating upward when I held my hand several inches above it. The warmth seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched my accelerated heartbeat, as if the table itself had become a living thing with its own circulation system. Steam rose from several spots on the surface, creating the vapor I had witnessed from across the room. My breathing became shallow and rapid as I processed this impossibility. Tables didn't generate heat. Laminated wood couldn't produce steam without an external source. Yet the evidence before me defied every natural law I understood, creating a reality that my mind struggled to accept. I backed away from table 20, my eyes never leaving the wisps of vapor that continued to rise from its surface. The chair remained pushed back, and I found myself wondering what kind of presence could affect physical objects without existing in any visible form. The thought sent ice through my veins, a cold that seemed to settle in my bones and radiate outward until my entire body shook with barely controlled tremors. The restaurant around me began to feel alien, as if the familiar space had been replaced by something that only resembled the place where I had worked for 3 years. The lighting seemed too bright now, creating stark shadows that moved independently of any logical source. The background hum of electrical systems grew louder, developing harmonics and overtones that suggested voices just beyond the range of comprehension. I forced myself to move toward the front of the restaurant, though my legs felt disconnected from my conscious control. Each step required enormous effort, as if I were walking through water or thick mud. The distance to the exit seemed to stretch with each movement, the familiar layout becoming maze-like and confusing. The chime above the front door began to ring softly, though no one was entering or leaving. Its gentle melody filled the space with an almost hypnotic quality, and I realized the sound was keeping time with the pulsing heat from table 20. The entire restaurant had become synchronized to some rhythm I couldn't identify, creating a symphony of unnatural phenomena that made my skin crawl with supernatural awareness. My hand finally reached the front door's deadbolt, and I struggled with the mechanism as if my fingers had forgotten how to perform this simple task. The metal felt unusually cold against my sweating palm, and the lock seemed to resist my efforts to turn it. When it finally disengaged with a sharp click, the sound echoed through the restaurant with the finality of a coffin lid closing. I pulled the door open and stepped into the night air, gasping as if I had been holding my breath for hours. The October wind felt like salvation against my overheated skin, and I turned to look back through the glass at the interior I had just escaped. Table 20 glowed with a soft, phosphorescent light that hadn't been visible under the harsh fluorescence. The chair remained pushed back, and now I could see the clear outline of a human form pressed into the vinyl seat, as if someone had sat there long enough to leave a permanent impression. The vapor continued to rise from the table's surface, but now it formed patterns that looked disturbingly like facial features before dissolving back into formless mist. I fumbled for my keys with hands that refused to remain steady, desperate to lock the door and create some barrier between myself and whatever occupied that space. But as I inserted the key, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Condensation covered the interior surface of the glass door, forming moisture patterns that spelled out words in neat, careful handwriting. The message was brief but unmistakable, written in the same methodical style I had witnessed at table 20. Same time tomorrow. The words began to fade even as I read them, the condensation evaporating in the warm air rising from inside the restaurant. Within seconds, no trace remained of the message, leaving only clean glass that reflected my pale, frightened face back at me. I locked the door with movements that felt mechanical and disconnected, my body operating on autopilot while my mind struggled to process what I had experienced. The keys slipped from my nerveless fingers twice before I managed to secure the deadbolt, each metallic jangle sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet night. The walk to my car felt like a journey through hostile territory, every shadow potentially concealing threats I couldn't name or understand. My peripheral vision kept catching movements that weren't there when I turned to look directly, creating a constant state of hypervigilance that left my muscles taut with tension. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes before starting the engine, staring back at the restaurant's illuminated windows. From outside, everything appeared normal, peaceful even. The dining room lights cast their cheerful glow across empty tables and chairs, creating the same scene I had witnessed hundreds of times before. No trace remained of the supernatural events I had witnessed. No evidence that anything extraordinary had occurred within those familiar walls. But I knew I would return tomorrow night, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain or resist. The message on the glass had been an invitation and a command simultaneously, establishing an appointment I felt powerless to break. Whatever presence had manifested at table 20 had marked me somehow, creating a connection that transcended the boundaries between the living world and whatever realm it inhabited. As I drove through the empty streets toward home, I caught myself checking the rearview mirror constantly, expecting to see the gray-haired figure in my back seat, wiping his forehead with that same methodical gesture. The night seemed darker than usual, the familiar route transformed into unfamiliar territory, by the knowledge that reality was far more fluid and dangerous than I had ever imagined. The next evening would come, and I would return to the restaurant as I always did. But now I knew I wouldn't be alone during those closing hours, that something waited patiently at table 20 for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. The thought should have terrified me completely, but instead, I felt an odd sense of anticipation building beneath the fear. Whatever that presence wanted, whatever purpose had drawn it to my restaurant, I would soon discover. And perhaps in that discovery, I would finally understand why the familiar had become strange, why the safe had become threatening, and why I no longer felt entirely alone in a world I thought I knew. Story 10. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like dying insects, casting sickly shadows that danced across the cracked linoleum floors of St. Mary's Hospital. The building had been condemned for 3 years, but the city still required someone to watch over it until demolition began. That someone was me, and tonight felt different from the moment I stepped through the rusted front doors. My footsteps echoed through the hollow corridors as I made my rounds, the sound bouncing off peeling wallpaper and broken windows that let in thin streams of moonlight. The air tasted stale, metallic, like old pennies left in a forgotten pocket. Every breath felt heavy in my lungs, as if the building itself was slowly suffocating anyone foolish enough to enter after dark. I'd been working security for abandoned buildings for 5 years, but St. Mary's unnerved me in ways I couldn't articulate. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, or how the temperature dropped to 20 degrees whenever I walked past the old surgical wing. Tonight, those familiar, unsettling details felt amplified, as if the building was holding its breath, waiting for something. The elevator at the end of the main corridor had been out of order since before the hospital closed. The brass doors were tarnished black, and someone had placed an out-of-order sign across them with duct tape that curled at the edges. I always avoided that section during my patrol, but tonight something pulled me toward it. My flashlight beam wavered as my hand trembled slightly, though I told myself it was just the cold. As I approached, I heard it, a mechanical whirring, the sound of cables moving and gears turning. The elevator was running. My heart began hammering against my ribs as I realized the impossibility of what I was hearing. The power to that section had been cut off months ago. I'd seen the disconnected wiring myself. The whirring grew louder, accompanied by a wet, dripping sound that seemed to echo from inside the shaft. Each drop hit with a hollow metallic ping, like water falling into an empty can. I pressed my ear against the cold brass doors, and the sound grew more distinct. Not just dripping, but something thicker, more viscous. Then the elevator arrived at my floor with a soft ding that sent ice through my veins. The doors slid open with a grinding screech of metal against metal, revealing an interior that made my stomach lurch. The floor was covered in surgical gloves, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all punctured and torn, forming a grotesque carpet that squelched under the weight of rusty water dripping from the ceiling. The water wasn't clear. It had the brown-red tinge of old blood mixed with rust, and it reeked of copper and decay. The gloves were scattered randomly, some bunched together, others spread flat against the elevator floor. Each one had multiple holes punched through the latex, as if someone had taken a scalpel and methodically destroyed them. The rusty water pooled in the creases and holes, creating small reservoirs that reflected my flashlight beam like dozens of tiny, accusing eyes. My breathing became shallow and rapid. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe the hospital had stored medical supplies in the elevator shaft. Maybe a pipe had burst somewhere above. But logic felt thin and fragile in the face of what I was seeing. The elevator's interior lights flickered sporadically, casting the scene in alternating brightness and shadow, making the gloves appear to writhe and move. I stepped back from the elevator, but it didn't close. It just waited there, doors gaping open like a mouth, the dripping sound growing more insistent. Each drop seemed to land with increasing volume, as if the building was trying to get my attention. My palms were slick with sweat despite the cold, and I wiped them on my pants, leaving damp patches on the fabric. Something compelled me to reach for one of the gloves, though every instinct screamed against it. My hand extended toward the elevator, trembling visibly now. As my fingers approached the nearest punctured glove, I noticed the holes weren't random. They formed patterns, deliberate, precise cuts that looked almost like tiny screaming mouths. I jerked my hand back, stumbling backward until my shoulders hit the wall. The impact sent a shock through my spine, and I realized I was breathing so hard I was getting dizzy. The metallic taste in my mouth had intensified, and my tongue felt thick and dry. The elevator doors began to close with agonizing slowness. I watched, transfixed, as the gap narrowed, but just before they met completely, something white caught my eye. One of the gloves had moved, shifting position on the floor. It now pointed directly at me, the holes in its fingertips aligned like targeting sights. The doors sealed shut with a final clang, but the dripping continued. I could hear it clearly through the brass barriers, wet, persistent, rhythmic, like a heartbeat made of falling liquid. I forced myself to walk away, but each step felt like moving through thick syrup. My legs shook with each movement, and I had to lean against the wall for support. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead of me, the flickering fluorescent lights creating a strobe effect that made my vision swim. Shadows jumped and danced in my peripheral vision, always just out of direct sight. Behind me, the elevator began moving again. I could hear it traveling between floors, up to the third, down to the basement, back up to the second. The pattern seemed random, but the dripping never stopped. If anything, it was getting louder, as if the volume of liquid was increasing with each trip. My radio crackled to life, startling me so badly I nearly dropped my flashlight. Static filled the air, but underneath it, I could swear I heard something else. A wet, squelching sound, like someone walking through puddles barefoot. I turned the radio off, but the sound continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air. The cold wasn't just environmental, it felt personal, invasive, as if something was stealing the warmth directly from my body. My fingers began to numb, and I shoved them into my pockets, but even there they remained ice cold. I needed to get to my security station on the first floor, away from this section of the hospital. But as I walked, I became aware that the dripping sound was following me. It seemed to come from above, as if the elevator was tracking my movement, staying directly overhead as I navigated the corridors. When I stopped, the dripping stopped. When I moved, it resumed, keeping perfect pace with my footsteps. The realization that something was matching my movements sent adrenaline surging through my system. My heart rate spiked so high I could feel it pulsing in my temples and wrists. Sweat broke out across my forehead despite the cold, and my shirt began sticking to my back. I broke into a jog, then a run, my footsteps echoing loudly through the empty halls. The dripping above matched my pace exactly, becoming a rapid staccato that sounded almost like applause. Water began seeping through the ceiling tiles, leaving dark stains that spread like ink blots across the white panels. Some of the stains took on recognizable shapes, hands reaching downward, faces with mouths agape, forms that looked disturbingly human. I reached the stairwell and yanked open the door, grateful to escape the dripping ceiling. But as I descended, I could hear the elevator moving again, traveling downward parallel to my route. The mechanical sounds echoed through the stairwell, amplified by the concrete walls until it sounded like a massive machine grinding and churning just beyond the walls. On the second-floor landing, I paused to catch my breath. My lungs burned, and each inhalation felt like swallowing broken glass. The stairwell was supposed to be silent, but I could hear something else now, a soft splashing sound, as if someone was walking through shallow water. I aimed my flashlight down the stairs and nearly choked on my own breath. Water was flowing up the steps, defying gravity, moving in a thin stream that reflected my light like a snake made of liquid metal. The water had the same rusty red tinge as what I'd seen in the elevator, and it was heading directly toward me. My rational mind completely abandoned me. I fled up the stairs instead of down, taking steps 3 at a time, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the walls. Behind me, the splashing sound intensified, as if the water was pursuing me with increasing urgency. I could smell it now, that metallic, coppery scent mixed with something organic and rotten. I burst through the door to the 3rd floor, gasping and wheezing. The corridor here was darker than the others, most of the fluorescent lights having burned out years ago. My flashlight seemed weaker, its beam swallowed by the oppressive darkness that pressed in from all sides. The elevator doors were directly in front of me, and they were open again. This time, the interior was different. The punctured gloves were gone, replaced by several inches of the rusty water that covered the entire floor. The liquid was perfectly still, like a dark mirror that reflected nothing. Steam rose from its surface in thin tendrils, and the smell hit me like a physical blow. Metallic blood mixed with antiseptic and something else, something that reminded me of fear itself. I approached against every instinct, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't understand or resist. My reflection should have been visible in the water, but the surface remained blank, as if I cast no reflection at all. The elevator lights flickered more rapidly now, creating a strobe effect that made the water appear to ripple and move. As I leaned closer, shapes began forming in the liquid, indistinct at first, then clearer. Faces, dozens of them, pressed against the surface from below as if trapped beneath glass. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. Some of the faces looked familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen them. One face rose closer to the surface than the others, and I realized with gut-wrenching horror that it was my own face, but wrong somehow. The features were mine, but the expression was one of absolute despair, and the eyes held a knowledge of something terrible that I hadn't yet experienced. My reflection that wasn't reached upward, its hand breaking through the surface of the water. Rusty liquid spilled over the edge of the elevator and onto my shoes, soaking through the leather instantly. The hand grasped at air, trying to grab onto something, someone, trying to grab onto me. I staggered backward as more hands emerged from the water, all reaching upward with desperate urgency. The faces below became more distinct, and I realized they weren't just random people. They were hospital staff, doctors, nurses, technicians, all wearing the same expression of horrified understanding. The truth hit me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just an abandoned hospital. Something had happened here. Something that had left these people trapped in some impossible space between life and death, condemned to relive their final moments of terror over and over again. And somehow, by witnessing this, by being here, I was becoming part of it. The elevator doors began closing again, but slower this time, as if reluctant to let me go. The hands reaching from the water became more frantic, grasping and clawing at the air just inches from my face. I could see my own reflection face among them now, its mouth moving as if trying to warn me of something. Just before the doors sealed completely, I heard it. Not through my ears, but directly in my mind. A voice that was mine, but not mine, speaking words that chilled me to my core. Don't let them know you've seen us. Don't let them know you know. The doors closed with finality, and the elevator descended, carrying its impossible cargo to depths that shouldn't exist in a 3-story building. The dripping had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I stood there for several more minutes, my entire body shaking uncontrollably. When I finally managed to move, I walked carefully to the stairwell and descended to the first floor, moving slowly and deliberately, forcing myself to think about mundane things. My grocery list, tomorrow's weather, anything but what I had witnessed. At my security station, I filled out my nightly report with hands that trembled so badly I could barely hold the pen. Under incidents, I wrote all quiet, no issues to report. The lie felt necessary, protective, as if telling the truth would somehow make it more real, more permanent. But as I sat there in my chair, trying to convince myself that exhaustion and isolation had caused me to hallucinate the entire experience, I became aware of a new sound: water, dripping steadily somewhere nearby. I looked up at the ceiling above my desk and saw a dark stain spreading across the tiles, growing larger with each drop that fell. The first drop landed on my report, right over the words, "No issues to report," the rusty water spreading the ink and making the text illegible. I looked up at the spreading stain, and for just a moment, I could swear I saw a face looking back down at me, my own face, wearing an expression of warning that I was finally beginning to understand. The elevator was still running somewhere in the building above me, carrying its burden of the trapped and the terrified, and now I knew that I would be returning tomorrow night, and the night after that, because something in that water-filled elevator had recognized me, had marked me as one of their own. The dripping continued, each drop marking time until I would join them completely, until my face would be among those pressed against the surface, trying desperately to warn the next person who stumbled upon St. Mary's terrible secret. I sat in my chair until dawn, listening to the waterfall, and wondering how long I had left before I stopped being just an observer of the horror and became part of it instead. Story 11. The morning mist clung to the reservoir like a burial shroud, and I should have turned back the moment I saw how the water moved, too still in some places, too restless in others, as if something beneath was stirring in its sleep. My running shoes struck the gravel path with their usual rhythm, but the sound felt wrong that morning. Each footfall seemed to echo twice, creating a phantom second runner just out of sync with my steps. I'd been coming to this reservoir for 3 years, every morning at 5 sharp, before the world woke up and contaminated the silence with its noise. But that Tuesday in October, everything felt different from the moment I stepped out of my car. The air was too thick, too warm for the season. My breath didn't fog the way it should have, and the usual symphony of dawn, birds stirring, water lapping gently against the concrete embankment, was replaced by an oppressive quiet that made my eardrums ache. I chalked it up to the approaching storm front I'd seen on the weather radar, pushed my earbuds in deeper, and started my usual 5-mile circuit. The first mile felt normal enough, though I kept catching myself glancing down at the water more than usual. The reservoir stretched out like a dark mirror, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple from some unseen disturbance below. The mist hung about 3 feet above the water, creating a gray curtain that obscured the far shore. I'd run this route hundreds of times, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the landscape was somehow unfamiliar, as if someone had moved everything slightly to the left while I wasn't looking. By the second mile, my heart was beating faster than it should have been for such an easy pace. My shirt clung to my back with sweat that felt colder than it should have in the humid air. I kept telling myself it was just the weather, just the strange atmospheric pressure that comes before a storm. But my body knew better. Every muscle fiber was tense. every nerve-ending screaming that something was watching me from the gray void where the mist met the water. That's when I first noticed my reflection was wrong. It started as just a nagging sense of something off in my peripheral vision. The water was calm enough to act as a mirror, and I could see my dark silhouette moving alongside me as I ran. But the movement felt delayed, disconnected, like watching a badly dubbed movie where the audio and video don't quite sync up. I slowed my pace and looked directly down at the water. My reflection was there, running in perfect time with my steps, but something about it made my stomach clench with dread. The figure in the water looked like me, same height, same build, same running gear, but it was facing the wrong direction. While I ran east along the northern shore, my reflection ran west, as if it were moving backward through the water while I moved forward on land. I stopped running. My reflection kept going. The cold that shot through my veins had nothing to do with the morning air. I stood frozen on the path, watching my doppelganger continue its westward journey beneath the surface until it disappeared into the mist-shrouded depths where the far shore should have been. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I could feel my pulse in my throat, in my temples, behind my eyes. I told myself I was seeing things. Trick of the light. Optical illusion caused by the mist and the unusual stillness of the water. I'd been working too many late nights, drinking too much coffee, not getting enough sleep. Hallucinations were a symptom of exhaustion, weren't they? I pulled out my phone to check the time, 5:23 a.m., and noticed my hands were shaking. The screen's blue glow reflected off the water's surface, creating a small pool of light that revealed nothing but dark water and the ghostly tendrils of mist. No reflection, no sign that anything unusual had happened. Just me, standing alone on a running path, sweating despite the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I should have gone home then. Should have driven straight back to my apartment, taken a hot shower, and called in sick to work. Instead, I started running again, telling myself that movement would burn away the unease that had settled in my gut like a lead weight. But the feeling only got worse. Every few steps, I found myself glancing down at the water, searching for my reflection. Sometimes it was there, behaving normally, running in the same direction I was running. Other times it wasn't there at all, as if I'd become a vampire, casting no reflection in the dark mirror of the reservoir. And sometimes, God help me, sometimes, I could swear I saw it running alongside me in the water, but facing the opposite direction, as if it were running backward through an underwater world that mirrored but didn't match our own. The mist began to thicken as I rounded the curve toward the dam. What had been a thin layer hovering above the water's surface now rose in billowing columns that obscured everything beyond 20 feet. The path ahead disappeared into gray nothingness, and I had to slow to a walk to keep from stumbling off the embankment. The silence was complete now. No birds, no distant traffic, no sound of water lapping against the shore. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the mist were absorbing all sound. That's when I heard the second set of footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. But as I slowed, they became clearer. The steady slap, slap, slap of running shoes on gravel, maintaining a pace just slightly faster than mine. I stopped walking and listened. The footsteps continued for 3 more beats, then stopped. My mouth went dry. I could taste copper on my tongue, could feel the familiar tight sensation in my chest that came with real fear, not the manufactured fear of horror movies or roller coasters, but the primal terror that screams at you to run, to hide, to do anything but stand still and wait for whatever is coming. I started walking again, faster this time. The footsteps resumed, matching my pace exactly. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, they slowed down. But they always seemed to be coming from behind me, even though every time I turned around, the path was empty, disappearing into the gray wall of mist. The logical part of my brain tried to explain it away. Echo. Sound distortion caused by the mist and the water. My own footsteps bouncing off the reservoir's surface and coming back to me with a slight delay. But logic was a thin voice drowned out by the growing certainty that something was following me. Something that moved when I moved and stopped when I stopped. Something that existed in the space between the real world and whatever lay beneath the water's surface. I reached the dam, where the path curved around the concrete spillway. The mist was so thick here that I could barely see my own feet. I had to feel my way along the metal railing, its cold surface slick with condensation. The sound of my fingers sliding along the wet metal was the only thing that proved I still existed in the real world. That's when I saw the light. It was coming from the water, maybe 30 feet from shore, a soft, blue-white glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. At first, I thought it might be some kind of underwater equipment, maybe something left behind by the water department or the Fish and Game Commission. But as I watched, the light began to move, tracing a pattern in the water that looked disturbingly familiar. It was running. The light was running beneath the surface, following the same path I'd been taking along the shore, but in reverse. I watched it travel from east to west, its pale glow creating ripples that spread outward in perfect concentric circles. And as it moved, I could swear I saw the silhouette of a human figure in the light, arms pumping, legs kicking, maintaining the steady rhythm of a distance runner. My reflection, my backwards reflection from earlier, it was still down there, still running, still moving in the wrong direction through an underwater world that followed different rules than the one I knew. I stumbled backward from the railing, my heart beating so fast I thought it might burst. The light continued its journey, growing brighter as it moved away from me, until it reached the point where the mist touched the water's surface. There, it stopped. The glow intensified, became almost blinding, and then winked out like a candle being snuffed. The mist began to clear almost immediately, rolling back toward the center of the reservoir in long serpentine tendrils. The familiar landscape of the dam and the far shore emerged from the gray veil, looking exactly as it always had. The water was calm, reflecting the gray sky and the dark silhouettes of bare trees. Nothing moved beneath its surface. But I knew what I'd seen, and more importantly, I knew what it meant. I'd lost something in that water. Some essential part of myself had broken away and was now living an independent existence in a world that ran parallel to but separate from my own. My reflection, my shadow, my doppelganger, whatever you wanted to call it, had decided it didn't want to be tied to me anymore. It had found a way to exist on its own, in a place where it could run in whatever direction it chose. The walk back to my car took forever. Every step felt like I was moving through thick syrup, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by something that knew me better than I knew myself. When I finally reached the parking lot, I turned back to look at the reservoir one more time. The water was perfectly still, perfectly normal, but I knew that beneath its surface, something that looked exactly like me was still running, would always be running, moving through an underwater landscape where the rules were different and reflections could choose their own direction. I haven't been back to the reservoir since that morning. I run on a treadmill now, in a gym with fluorescent lights and mirrors on every wall. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I catch myself looking into those mirrors and wondering if the person looking back is really me, or if it's something else entirely, something that learned to mimic my movements so perfectly that I can't tell the difference anymore. And sometimes, when the light hits the bathroom mirror just right as I'm brushing my teeth, I could swear the reflection blinks a fraction of a second after I do, as if it's making its own decisions about when and how to move. On those nights, I close my eyes and count to 10 before looking again, but I know that someday I'm going to open them and find that the reflection has turned around, has started walking away from the mirror, ready to disappear into whatever world exists on the other side of the glass. The worst part isn't the fear that my reflection might leave me. The worst part is the growing certainty that it already has, and what's looking back at me now is something else entirely, something that's been practicing my expressions and learning my habits, waiting for the right moment to step through the mirror and take my place in the world I thought was mine. Story 12. The fluorescent lights above flickered with a sickly buzz, casting stuttering shadows across rows of forgotten toys. Dust particles danced in the unsteady beams like microscopic specters, and the air carried the musty scent of decades-old plastic and deteriorating cardboard. I stood at the entrance of Wonderland Toys' abandoned warehouse, clipboard in hand, wondering why anyone would pay me to catalog this graveyard of childhood dreams. My name is Marcus Webb, and I make my living counting other people's forgotten inventory. Usually it's straightforward work, boxes of surplus electronics, outdated office supplies, or seasonal merchandise that never sold. But this job felt different from the moment I received the call. The voice on the phone had been hesitant, almost apologetic, explaining that the previous inventory specialist had quit without notice after only 2 days on the job. The warehouse stretched before me like a cathedral of abandoned playthings. Shelves towered 30 feet high, packed with boxes whose labels had faded to illegibility. Mannequin heads sporting wigs in various states of decay stared down from upper shelves, their plastic eyes reflecting the unstable light. Action figures hung from hooks like tiny crucifixions, their limbs positioned in unnatural angles that suggested struggle rather than play. I pulled out my tablet and began the methodical process of documentation. Each item required a photo, description, and condition assessment. The work was tedious, but the pay was exceptional, suspiciously so for such routine labor. The client had emphasized speed over thoroughness, which struck me as odd since inventory work typically demanded precision above all else. As I moved deeper into the warehouse, my footsteps echoed with a hollow sound that seemed to linger longer than physics should allow. The temperature dropped noticeably, though the building's heating system hummed steadily somewhere in the depths of the structure. My breath began to form small clouds, and I found myself rubbing my arms through my jacket sleeves. The first section consisted mainly of board games and puzzles. Monopoly sets from the 1980s sat beside jigsaw puzzles depicting pastoral scenes that somehow looked more ominous than peaceful in the harsh fluorescent glare. My fingers grew numb as I photographed each item, and I had to blow on them repeatedly to maintain dexterity. It was in the third aisle that I encountered the dolls. They occupied an entire section, arranged on shelves like a macabre audience. Baby dolls with cherubic faces sat beside fashion dolls with impossibly long limbs and painted-on clothing. Their eyes, glass, plastic, or painted, seemed to track my movement as I passed. Several times I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, certain that one had shifted position when I wasn't looking directly at it. My heart rate began to elevate, a steady thrum in my chest that I tried to attribute to the cold air and physical exertion, but the sensation of being watched pressed against me like a physical weight. I quickened my pace, snapping photos without my usual attention to detail, eager to move on to a less unsettling section. The electronic toys occupied the rear quarter of the warehouse. Remote-controlled cars with their controllers still attached sat in neat rows, their plastic bodies dulled by years of neglect. Handheld games from the early days of digital entertainment lay scattered across tables, their screens dark and lifeless. It was here that I found the animatronic figures. They were arranged in a semicircle on a raised platform, like performers frozen mid-show. A mechanical bear in a top hat stood center stage, its arms positioned as if conducting an orchestra. To its left, a clown with faded makeup held a set of juggling balls forever suspended in an arrested throw. On the right, a cowboy figure gripped a toy pistol, its painted eyes staring into the middle distance with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The sight of them triggered a visceral response I couldn't explain. My throat constricted, and I found myself swallowing repeatedly against a sudden dryness. The hair on my arms stood erect beneath my jacket sleeves, and a cold sweat began to form along my spine despite the already frigid air. I approached the platform cautiously, my tablet held ready to photograph the collection. The animatronics appeared to be in decent condition, though their costumes showed signs of age and moisture damage. Each figure was approximately 4 feet tall, sized to entertain without intimidating. At least, that had likely been the intention. As I circled the platform, documenting each figure from multiple angles, I noticed something peculiar. None of the animatronics were connected to power sources. Their electrical cords lay coiled beside them, unplugged and apparently unused for years. Yet something about their positioning seemed too deliberate, too alive for mere storage. The bear's expression particularly disturbed me. Its painted smile was wide and welcoming, but the eyes held a quality I couldn't define. Not quite intelligence, but something more than the vacant stare of inanimate plastic. I found myself staring into those glass orbs longer than professionally necessary, searching for something I couldn't name. My documentation of the electronics section took far longer than anticipated. Every few minutes I would pause and listen to the warehouse's ambient sounds, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the distant hum of the heating system, the subtle creaks and settles of an aging building. But increasingly, I detected other sounds, soft whispers that might have been air moving through vents, gentle scratching that could have been mice in the walls, or the barely perceptible whir of machinery that should have been silent. By the time I reached the final section, my nerves were stretched taut. The warehouse's oppressive atmosphere had burrowed into my psyche, and I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, convinced that something was moving in my peripheral vision. My hands shook slightly as I handled the remaining items, and I had to retake several photographs due to motion blur. The last aisle contained miscellaneous items that defied easy categorization. Toy musical instruments, magic sets, and novelty items filled the shelves in haphazard arrangement. It was here that I discovered the main electrical panel for the warehouse, housed in a gray metal box mounted on the far wall. The panel was clearly marked and appeared to be in working order. According to the posted diagram, it controlled lighting circuits throughout the building. I studied it with growing curiosity, wondering why the client would need the warehouse's electrical system documented as part of the inventory. The request seemed unusual, but I had been specifically instructed to photograph all infrastructure elements. As I raised my tablet to capture the electrical panel, my finger accidentally brushed against the main breaker switch. The contact was brief and light, but sufficient to engage the mechanism. The switch clicked into the active position with a sound that seemed to reverberate through the entire building. The warehouse transformed instantly. Every fluorescent fixture blazed to life simultaneously, banishing the shadows that had lurked in corners and between shelves. The sudden brightness was overwhelming after hours of working in dim, flickering light. I blinked rapidly, my eyes streaming as they adjusted to the illumination. But it was the sound that stopped my heart. From the rear of the warehouse came a mechanical whirring, followed by the unmistakable sound of gears engaging. I turned toward the noise, my body moving with dreamlike slowness, and watched in horror as the animatronic bear began to move. Its head turned with deliberate, mechanical precision, rotating until its painted eyes fixed directly on my position across the warehouse. The movement was smooth and purposeful, utterly inconsistent with the figure's disconnected state. The bear's mouth opened and closed in a silent pantomime of speech, its jaw moving with the rhythmic persistence of a broken record. My tablet slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering to the concrete floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force that I wondered if the mechanical rhythm might be audible to whatever intelligence animated the distant figure. The bear's companions began to stir. The clown's head swiveled with jerky, unnatural movements, while its juggling arm moved up and down in a repetitive motion that served no purpose. The cowboy figure's gun arm rose and fell, as if firing shot after shot at an invisible target. I stood frozen, my rational mind struggling to process what I was witnessing. The figures had no power source, no connection to the electrical system I had just activated. Yet they moved with purposeful animation, their movements synchronized in a parody of their original programming. My breath came in short, shallow gasps that fogged in the cold air. Sweat ran down my spine despite the warehouse's frigid temperature, and my hands trembled uncontrollably. The primitive part of my brain screamed at me to run, to flee this place of impossible occurrences and malevolent toys. But I remained rooted to the spot, transfixed by the mechanical ballet unfolding in the distance. The animatronics continued their repetitive movements, their actions growing more vigorous with each cycle. The bear's head movements became more rapid, its painted smile stretching wider as if responding to some unheard joke. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the mechanical symphony ceased. The figures froze in mid-motion, their limbs locked in awkward positions that spoke of interrupted purpose. The warehouse fell silent except for the steady hum of the now functioning electrical system and my own ragged breathing. I remained motionless for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, waiting for the mechanical nightmare to resume. When nothing happened, I slowly retrieved my tablet from the floor, never taking my eyes off the distant platform. The screen had cracked in the fall, spiderweb fractures radiating from the point of impact, but the device still functioned, and I could see that my documentation was complete. Every item in the warehouse had been cataloged, photographed, and assessed. I began to back toward the exit, my movements careful and controlled. Each step carried me farther from the animatronic figures, but I couldn't shake the sensation that they were somehow aware of my retreat. My shoulder blades crawled with the certainty that those painted eyes were tracking my movement, even though I dared not turn to confirm my suspicion. The walk to the warehouse entrance stretched endlessly. Shadows that had been banished by the full lighting seemed to reach for me from between the shelves, and every sound I made echoed with unnatural persistence. My breathing sounded impossibly loud in my own ears, and I found myself holding my breath for long periods to minimize the noise. When I finally reached the entrance, I turned for one last look at the warehouse interior. The animatronic figures stood motionless on their platform, their positions unchanged from when the mechanical episode had ended. In the harsh fluorescent light, they appeared almost pitiful, faded relics of entertainment past, harmless and inanimate. But as I watched, the bear's head turned once more. The movement was subtle, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. Its painted eyes met mine across the vast space, and I swear I saw something like recognition in those glass orbs. I ran. My feet pounded against the concrete as I fled the warehouse, not stopping until I reached my car in the parking lot. My hands shook so violently that I could barely insert the key into the ignition, and when the engine finally turned over, I drove away without looking back. The next morning, I submitted my inventory report electronically, including all photographs and documentation required by the contract. I made no mention of the animatronic figure's behavior, reasoning that no one would believe such an account. The client accepted the report without question and processed my payment immediately. I never took another inventory job in a toy warehouse, but sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I find myself thinking about those mechanical figures. I wonder if they continue their silent vigil in that forgotten warehouse, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor to activate their impossible animation. The thought sends shivers down my spine and reminds me that some things are better left undisturbed, no matter how generous the compensation. The check from Wonderland Toys cleared my bank account 3 days later. I deposited it without a second thought, but I never spent the money. It sits in my savings account, untouched, like a reminder of an experience I'm not entirely sure I want to remember. Because sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the mechanical whirring of gears that shouldn't turn, and see painted eyes that follow movement they should never perceive. And in those moments, I wonder if leaving that warehouse was really the end of the story, or just the beginning of something far more terrifying. Story 13. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, leaving me alone in the suffocating darkness of the abandoned roadside diner. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing overturned chairs and tables coated in a thick layer of dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. The silence pressed against my eardrums like water at the bottom of a deep well. I'd been hired to inspect the electrical systems of the Route 66 diner before the demolition crew arrived next week. The place had been shuttered for 15 years, ever since the highway was rerouted, and the last of the truckers found newer, cleaner stops further down the road. Now it sat like a forgotten monument to America's fading past, its neon sign dark and its windows boarded up with weathered plywood. My boots echoed against the cracked linoleum as I made my way toward the main electrical panel behind the counter. The air tasted stale and metallic, carrying the faint odor of grease that had long since gone rancid. Every step sent small clouds of dust swirling through my flashlight beam, and I found myself breathing through my mouth to avoid the musty smell that seemed to coat the inside of my nostrils. The electrical panel hung open, its metal door dangling from one hinge. Someone had been here before me, probably copper thieves looking to strip the valuable wiring. But as I examined the circuits with my multimeter, I noticed something odd. Despite the apparent vandalism, most of the main lines were still intact. The damage looked superficial, almost cosmetic. I flipped the main breaker, and the diner suddenly hummed to life. The overhead lights sputtered and caught, casting harsh shadows across the dining room. The ancient refrigerator behind the counter began its labored wheezing, and somewhere in the back, a radio crackled to life, filling the space with static. That's when I noticed the television. It sat in the corner booth where truckers used to nurse their coffee and watch the late-night news. The screen was dark, its surface reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights above. But as I moved closer to check the outlet beneath it, something made me pause. Two figures stood in the center of the black screen. They were dressed like cowboys from an old Western movie, wide-brimmed hats, leather chaps, and gun belts slung low on their hips. One was tall and lean, the other shorter and stockier. They stood perfectly still, facing each other as if frozen in the middle of a conversation. The detail was remarkable, so clear I could make out the individual stitches on their vests and the weathered lines on their faces. My heart began to pound against my ribs. The television was unplugged. The cord lay coiled on the floor beside the booth, its prongs covered in dust. Yet there they were, as clear as if someone had painted them directly onto the glass. I reached for my phone to take a picture, but my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The screen showed no bars. Of course, the cell towers out here were few and far between, and the diner sat in a dead zone between two hills. I moved closer to the television, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figures remained motionless, their eyes fixed on each other. But as I approached, something even stranger happened. My reflection, which should have appeared in the dark screen alongside theirs, was nowhere to be seen. The glass showed only the two cowboys, as if I were invisible. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. I held up my hand in front of the screen, waving it back and forth. Nothing. The surface reflected the lights above, the dusty booth, even the cracked ceiling tiles, but it showed no trace of me. I stumbled backward, my legs hitting the edge of the booth seat. The vinyl cushion wheezed under my weight, releasing a cloud of ancient dust that made me cough. When I looked back at the screen, the cowboys had moved. They were no longer facing each other. Now they both stared directly at me. The tall one's mouth was moving, as if he were speaking, but no sound came from the television speakers. His companion nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off me. The shorter cowboy's hand rested on the grip of his revolver, his thumb hooked over the hammer. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead and ran down my back, soaking my shirt. My mouth had gone completely dry, and I could taste copper on my tongue. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that I was hallucinating, that the isolation and the eerie atmosphere were playing tricks on me. But the cowboys continued to stare. I forced myself to look away, focusing instead on the rest of the diner. The lights continued their erratic flickering, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The radio's static had grown louder, occasionally crackling with what sounded like fragments of old-time music, fiddles and banjos that faded in and out like distant memories. When I looked back at the television, the screen was completely black. I approached it again, my footsteps echoing in the empty diner. The surface reflected normally now, showing my pale, frightened face in the chaos of the dining room behind me. I reached out to touch the glass, and my reflection did the same. The screen was ice cold. I decided to finish my inspection quickly and get out. But as I turned toward the kitchen, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Spurs. The distinctive metallic jingling of spurs on hardwood floors. I spun around, shining my flashlight toward the sound. The beam swept across empty booths and overturned chairs, but revealed nothing. The jingling continued, growing closer, accompanied by the soft scuff of leather boots. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the walls and ceiling like a ghost's footsteps. The temperature in the diner plummeted. My breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and I could see frost forming on the metal surfaces around me. The fluorescent lights above flickered more violently now, casting wild shadows that danced across the walls like demons. I heard a chair scrape against the floor. In the corner booth, the television was on again. Not the screen itself, but the area around it seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. The two cowboys were back, but now they were sitting at the table in the booth, facing me directly. The tall one had his hat pushed back, revealing a face that was gaunt and weathered, with eyes that seemed to burn with inner fire. His companion kept his head down, but I could see him shuffling a deck of cards with mechanical precision. They were waiting for me. I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I approached that booth again, something terrible would happen. But I also knew I couldn't stay pressed against this wall forever. The temperature continued to drop, and my fingers were going numb despite the thick gloves I wore. The sound of spurs grew louder, closer, and I could swear I heard the creak of leather and the soft whisper of fabric. I made my decision. Moving as quietly as possible, I edged along the wall toward the front door. The cowboys in the television watched my progress, their heads turning to follow my movement. The tall one's mouth moved again, and this time I thought I could make out words, though no sound reached my ears. Stay and play. The shorter cowboy looked up from his cards, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. It was a face I recognized from the faded photographs that still hung on the diner's walls. Pictures of the original owner and his business partner, the men who had built this place back in the 1950s. But those men had died decades ago, killed in a car accident on the very highway that ran past the diner. I reached the door and grabbed the handle, pulling with all my strength. It wouldn't budge. The metal was so cold it burned my skin through my gloves, and frost had formed around the frame, sealing it shut. Behind me, the sound of spurs grew louder, accompanied now by low, gravelly laughter that seemed to come from the television speakers. I turned to look, and the cowboys were standing again, their hands resting on their gun belts. They were no longer confined to the screen. I could see them clearly in the reflection of the darkened windows, walking slowly toward me across the dining room floor. But when I looked directly at the room, it was empty. They existed only in reflections, in the surfaces that should have shown my own image but didn't. I watched in horror as they approached, their boots making no sound on the actual floor but creating that terrible jingling of spurs in the reflected world. I pounded on the door, throwing my shoulder against it with desperate strength. The frame groaned, but held firm. The cowboys were almost upon me now, their reflected forms towering over my hunched shoulders. I could feel their presence like a physical weight, cold and oppressive, pressing down on me from all sides. The tall cowboy reached out, his reflected hand stretching toward my reflected throat. That's when I remembered the circuit breaker. I sprinted toward the electrical panel, my boots sliding on the dusty floor. Behind me, the jingling of spurs quickened to a trot, then a gallop. I could hear the cowboy's reflected laughter growing louder, more triumphant. I reached the panel and slammed the main breaker down. The lights died instantly, plunging the diner back into darkness. The refrigerator wheezed to a stop, and the radio fell silent. In the sudden quiet, I could hear only my own ragged breathing and the wild pounding of my heart. The sound of spurs had stopped. I waited in the darkness for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When I finally dared to turn my flashlight back on, the diner looked exactly as it had when I'd first entered. Empty, dusty, and abandoned. The television screen was dark and lifeless, reflecting nothing but my own terrified face. I didn't bother to check the rest of the electrical system. I packed my tools with shaking hands and left through the back door, which opened easily now that the power was off. As I loaded my equipment into my truck, I could see the diner's dark windows in my rearview mirror, but they showed only my own reflection. I drove away without looking back. The next morning, I called the demolition company and told them the electrical system was beyond repair. There was nothing to salvage, I said. They should tear it down as soon as possible. I never told anyone what really happened in that diner. Who would believe me? But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving past old, abandoned places, I catch glimpses of figures in my mirrors that aren't there when I look directly. Cowboys with weathered faces and burning eyes, still playing their endless game of cards, still waiting for someone foolish enough to sit down and join them at their table. The Route 66 diner was demolished 3 days later. The local newspaper ran a small article about it, mentioning that the building had been the site of several strange incidents over the years. Travelers reported seeing lights in the windows late at night, and more than one person claimed to have heard music and laughter coming from inside the abandoned building. The article also mentioned that the original owners, two partners who had built the diner in the 1950s, had died in a car crash right outside their establishment in 1962. They'd been on their way home from a poker game, the story said, when their car skidded off the icy road and hit a tree. Local legend claimed they'd been winning big that night, and their pockets were full of money that was never found. The land where the diner stood is empty now, just a patch of weeds and broken concrete beside the old highway. But sometimes, truckers passing by late at night report seeing the ghostly outline of neon signs in their peripheral vision, and the faint sound of spurs jingling in the wind. I've never driven that stretch of road again. Some gambles aren't worth taking, and some games are never meant to end. Story 14. The silence hit me first. Absolute unnatural silence where there should have been chaos. I'd been working at Riverside Animal Shelter for 3 years, and never once had I walked into the kennel area without being greeted by a symphony of barks, whines, and the scraping of claws against concrete. The dogs always knew when someone was coming. They could hear footsteps from halfway across the building, their ears perked and bodies alert, ready to compete for attention with desperate enthusiasm. But not today. The heavy metal door clanged shut behind me, the sound echoing through what felt like a tomb. My work boots squeaked against the polished concrete as I moved forward, water buckets in hand, expecting the usual eruption of noise. Instead, I found myself surrounded by an oppressive quiet that made my ears ring. 23 dogs lined the corridor in their individual runs, and every single one stood motionless, positioned at the front of their enclosures. Not pacing, not lying down, not even breathing heavily. They stood like statues carved from flesh and fur, their bodies rigid with tension I'd never seen before. All of them faced the same direction. The far wall at the end of the corridor stretched bare and white, recently painted after last month's renovation. Nothing hung on it. No cracks marred its surface. No shadows fell across its expanse. Yet every dog stared at that wall with the kind of focused intensity I'd only seen from predators watching prey. My throat constricted as I set down the water buckets, the plastic handles slipping from suddenly sweaty palms. The containers hit the floor with hollow thuds that seemed to amplify in the unnatural silence. Not one dog turned toward the sound. Their eyes remained fixed ahead, unblinking, as if witnessing something beyond my perception. A bead of sweat rolled down my spine despite the cool air conditioning. I called out to Max, the golden retriever mix in the first kennel, using the cheerful tone that usually sent him into tail-wagging ecstasy. He didn't even twitch. His breathing came in slow, measured intervals, but his muscles remained coiled tight beneath his coat. I moved closer to his run, studying his expression. His eyes had gone wide, pupils dilated despite the fluorescent lighting overhead. The whites showed more than they should, giving him an almost human look of terror. His lips had pulled back slightly, not in aggression but in the kind of grimace that preceded a scream. The same expression marked every face down the line. My heart began hammering against my ribs as I walked the corridor, checking each animal. Bella, the pit bull who'd been returned 3 times for being too energetic, stood frozen mid-step, as if someone had hit a pause button on her existence. The beagle puppies, usually a writhing mass of play and exploration, had arranged themselves in a perfect line, their small bodies trembling but motionless. Even Goliath, the massive Rottweiler with anxiety issues who usually cowered at the back of his kennel, had positioned himself at the front, staring with the others. His powerful frame shook with barely contained energy, but he held his position like a soldier at attention. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their harsh brightness casting everything in stark relief. But somehow, that end wall seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, appearing dimmer than it should. The white paint looked almost gray in certain spots, as if shadows moved beneath the surface. I rubbed my eyes, blinking hard. When I looked again, the wall appeared normal. Just a freshly painted surface reflecting the overhead lights exactly as it should. My breathing had become shallow, each inhale requiring conscious effort. The air felt thick, pressing against my chest like water. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe the dogs had been spooked by construction noise from outside. Perhaps a small earthquake had unsettled them, though I hadn't felt anything. Some kind of ultrasonic frequency from nearby electronics could explain their behavior. But none of those explanations addressed the synchronized nature of their attention, or the fact that they seemed terrified rather than merely alert. I grabbed the first water bowl, deciding to focus on my routine. Work would ground me, give my hands something to do while my mind processed what I was witnessing. The familiar motions of unscrewing kennel latches and replacing water might break whatever spell had settled over this place. Max's bowl was nearly empty, as expected. I unlatched his kennel door and stepped inside, expecting him to turn toward me or at least acknowledge my presence. He remained perfectly still, his gaze locked on that wall 30 feet away. I could hear his breathing now, rapid and shallow, as if he'd been running. As I lifted his water bowl, my fingers brushed against his fur. His body was rigid as a board, every muscle taut with tension. Heat radiated from his skin, not the warmth of a healthy dog, but the fever heat of extreme stress. His coat was damp with perspiration, something I'd rarely seen in canines outside of medical emergencies. The bowl slipped from my hands and clattered to the concrete floor. The sound rang out like a gunshot in the silence. And then the wall responded. A long, deliberate scraping noise emanated from the bare surface, as if massive claws were dragging across the interior of the wall from the other side. The sound traveled from floor to ceiling in one slow, methodical stroke that made my teeth ache. Plaster dust drifted down from where the sound had passed, and a thin line appeared in the paint. Not a crack, but a groove, as if something had carved through the wall from within. Every dog released a soft whimper simultaneously, 23 voices joining in a harmony of fear that raised the hair on my arms. But they didn't move. They didn't break their vigilant watch. My legs nearly buckled. I grabbed the kennel door for support, my knuckles white against the metal bars. The scratch mark on the wall was real. I could see it clearly. A dark gouge running from about 2 feet off the floor up to roughly shoulder height. Plaster dust continued to settle at the base of the wall like snow. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Settling building, pipes in the wall, some kind of structural issue causing the surface to crack. But pipes didn't make scratching sounds, and settling didn't create perfect gouges that appeared in real time. I backed out of Max's kennel, my movements slow and deliberate. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of this place as quickly as possible. But my legs felt disconnected from my brain, heavy and unresponsive. My breathing came in short gasps that didn't seem to deliver enough oxygen to my lungs. The dogs remained at their posts, sentinels watching for something I couldn't see or understand. Their collective fear was a palpable presence in the room, pressing against me like a physical weight. The air itself seemed to thicken, making each breath a conscious effort. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that stress and overwork had finally caught up with me. But the scratch mark remained visible on the wall, dark and deep against the white paint. Real, undeniable. A second scraping sound began, this one starting from a different point on the wall. Lower, more deliberate. The noise seemed to come from deep within the structure, as if something massive was moving between the walls of the building. The sound of claws, but not dog claws, not cat claws. Something larger, something that shouldn't exist. This new gouge appeared parallel to the first, creating what looked like the beginning of a crude tally mark system. The plaster dust fell more heavily this time, creating small piles on the floor directly beneath each mark. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, needing to document what I was seeing before my mind could convince me it hadn't happened. The device felt foreign in my trembling fingers, the screen too bright in the fluorescent lighting. I raised it to photograph the wall, but the camera wouldn't focus properly. The scratches appeared blurry in the viewfinder, as if the phone couldn't quite process what it was seeing. A third scratch began. This one moved differently, not straight up and down, but diagonal, connecting the top of one vertical mark to the bottom of another. The sound was longer, more complex, like fingernails on a chalkboard, amplified and distorted. It made my jaw clench involuntarily, my back teeth grinding together with such force I thought they might crack. The dogs' whimpering grew louder, but they held their positions. Even the puppies, who should have been incapable of such discipline, maintained their terrified vigil. Their small bodies shook with the effort of remaining still, while every instinct told them to flee. I backed toward the door, each step measured and careful. The floor felt unsteady beneath my feet, as if the building itself was shifting. My peripheral vision caught movement, but when I turned to look directly, nothing was there. Just shadows cast by the overhead lights, playing tricks on overstimulated nerves. The wall now bore 3 distinct marks forming a rough triangle. Inside that triangle, the paint seemed darker somehow, as if something was bleeding through from behind. The surface rippled slightly, like water disturbed by a stone, but when I blinked hard and looked again, it appeared solid and normal. My back hit the metal door, the cold steel shocking against my sweat-soaked shirt. The exit was right behind me, safety just a door handle away, but I couldn't tear my eyes from that wall, from the impossible marks scarring its surface. A fourth sound began, but this one was different. Not scratching, but something closer to knocking. Slow, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from multiple points along the wall simultaneously. The painted surface began to bulge outward in small sections, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. The bulges appeared and disappeared in sequence, like a monstrous game of whack-a-mole. The dogs finally moved. As one, they backed away from the fronts of their kennels, retreating to the far corners of their runs. But their eyes never left the wall. They pressed themselves against the back walls of their enclosures, bodies low and trembling, ready to bolt if their doors opened. My heart hammered so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. The sound mixed with the rhythmic tapping to create a percussion section from hell. Each tap seemed to sync with my pulse, as if whatever was behind the wall was listening to my terror and responding to it. I turned the door handle, desperate for escape, but it wouldn't budge. The metal was ice cold against my palm, so cold it burned. I pulled harder, putting my full weight behind it, but the door remained sealed shut, as if welded in place. Panic flooded my system, sending adrenaline coursing through my veins. My vision narrowed to a tunnel focused on that door handle, my only hope of escape. I yanked and twisted, the metal cutting into my palm, but it wouldn't move. The building had become a trap, and I was locked inside with something that shouldn't exist. Behind me, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. I could hear plaster beginning to crack and fall, hitting the floor in larger chunks. Whatever was behind that wall was trying to break through. I spun around to face the wall, my back pressed against the unyielding door. The surface was now covered in bulges and indentations, the paint cracking and peeling away in strips. The triangle of scratches had grown darker, and within that dark space, I could swear I saw movement. Not shadows this time, but something solid shifting behind a barrier that was growing thinner by the second. The dogs had gone silent again, but this time their silence was different. Not the unnatural quiet of frozen terror, but the held-breath silence of prey, hoping to avoid detection. They had pressed themselves so far into the corners of their runs that some were barely visible. The tapping stopped. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my own ragged breathing, the frantic beating of my heart, and something else. Something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. Breathing. From the other side of the wall. Deep, slow respirations that didn't match any rhythm a human lung could produce. The sound was too big, too deliberate, like a sleeping giant drawing breath. Each inhale seemed to pull air from the room where I stood, creating a subtle pressure change that popped my ears. The wall began to bow outward in one central spot, the paint stretching like rubber before finally splitting with a sound like tearing fabric. Through the crack, absolute darkness stared back at me. Not the darkness of an empty space, but something that actively absorbed light, drinking it in and giving nothing back. And in that darkness, something blinked. I found my voice then, a strangled cry that seemed to break whatever spell had held the door closed. The handle turned freely in my hand, and I stumbled backward into the corridor beyond, slamming the metal door shut behind me. My legs gave out, and I slid down the wall to sit on the cold linoleum floor, gasping like a drowning man. Through the small window in the door, I could see into the kennel area. The wall appeared normal again, freshly painted white without a mark on it. The dogs were moving around their runs naturally, some drinking water, others lying in their beds. Everything looked exactly as it should. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced, and I knew that whatever lived behind that wall was still there, waiting for the next person to enter that room alone. I quit that day, walking out without explanation or apology. But sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I still hear that breathing, deep and slow and patient, as if something is waiting for me to return. And sometimes I catch myself staring at the walls of my own home, wondering what might be watching from the other side. Story 15. The silence in the old Victorian mansion should have been comforting, but instead it pressed against my eardrums like cotton soaked in ice water. Every board beneath my feet seemed to exhale with the weight of decades, releasing whispers of dust and decay that made my throat constrict. I had inherited this place from my great-uncle Morris 3 months ago, and this was my first extended stay, a week-long retreat to decide whether to sell or renovate. The decision was supposed to be simple, practical. It was anything but. The house sat perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, its weathered shingles and towering gables cutting a jagged silhouette against the perpetually gray Oregon sky. Morris had lived here alone for 30 years after his wife died, and the isolation had seeped into every corner like a stain. The locals in the nearby town spoke of him in hushed tones, describing a man who had grown increasingly reclusive, increasingly strange. They mentioned seeing lights in windows that should have been boarded up, hearing voices carried on the wind from a house where only one old man lived. I had dismissed their stories as small-town gossip until my first night alone in the mansion. The guest room was located on the second floor, directly above the kitchen. I had chosen to sleep in the master bedroom at the opposite end of the hall, partly for comfort, and partly because something about that particular room made my skin crawl. The door was always slightly ajar, no matter how firmly I closed it, and the afternoon light that filtered through its heavy curtains seemed somehow thinner, more hesitant than it should have been. It was on my third night that I first heard the voices. I had been lying in bed, listening to the ocean waves crash against the rocks below, when a low murmur drifted through the walls. My pulse quickened immediately, a primal response that sent cold fingers racing down my spine. The sound was too rhythmic to be wind, too structured to be settling wood. It was conversation, two distinct voices engaged in what sounded like an animated discussion. My bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor before I fully realized I was moving. The voices were coming from the guest room. I pressed my ear against the hallway wall, my breathing shallow and controlled. The words were indistinct, muffled by the thick plaster, but the cadence was unmistakably human. One voice was deeper, more authoritative. The other higher, almost pleading. They spoke in patterns that suggested argument, negotiation, perhaps even desperation. My hands trembled as I reached for the guest room doorknob. The metal was so cold it burned my palm. I turned it slowly, expecting resistance, but it gave way with a soft click that seemed to echo through the entire house. The door swung open to reveal nothing but moonlight streaming through gauzy curtains and the outline of furniture draped in dust covers. The voices had stopped the moment my hand touched the door. I stood in the doorway for what felt like hours, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was certain it was visible through my thin t-shirt. Sweat had begun to gather at the base of my skull, despite the chill that seemed to emanate from the room itself. The silence was now complete, oppressive, as if the house were holding its breath. Sleep eluded me for the remainder of that night. I lay rigid in bed, every muscle tensed, listening for any repetition of the sounds. But the house remained stubbornly quiet, offering nothing but the steady rhythm of waves and the occasional groan of old timber. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it had been a dream, a product of being alone in an unfamiliar place. Almost. The next evening brought rain, a steady drumming against the windows that should have been soothing, but instead created a wall of white noise that made every other sound seem amplified and threatening. I had spent the day in town, buying supplies and trying to shake off the previous night's unease. The locals had been friendly enough, but I noticed how their smiles faltered when I mentioned which house I was staying in. An elderly woman at the grocery store had gripped my arm with surprising strength when I mentioned Morris's name, her eyes wide with something that might have been concern, or might have been fear. She had told me that Morris used to come into town talking about his visitors, describing elaborate conversations with people who never seemed to leave. The other townspeople had attributed this to loneliness, to the gradual deterioration of an aging mind. But the woman seemed less certain. She mentioned strange occurrences, delivery men who refused to approach the house, utility workers who claimed to hear voices from empty rooms, a mailman who insisted he had seen figures in windows that should have been dark. I returned to the mansion with my nerves already frayed, jumping at every shadow the swaying trees cast across the driveway. The house loomed larger somehow in the storm, its dark windows like vacant eye sockets watching my approach. Inside, the familiar scents of old wood and must were overlaid with something else, something that reminded me of ozone, the sharp smell that lingered after lightning strikes. The voices returned with the darkness. This time I was ready. I had positioned myself in the hallway outside the guest room, armed with a flashlight and my phone set to record. The conversation began as before. Two distinct voices engaged in what sounded like intense discussion. But tonight I could make out fragments of words, snippets of meaning that made my blood run cold. The deeper voice seemed to be giving instructions, its tone urgent and commanding. The higher voice responded with what sounded like protests, objections that grew increasingly frantic. I pressed closer to the door, my breathing so shallow I was beginning to feel lightheaded. The words became clearer, something about time running out, about opportunities being wasted, about consequences that couldn't be avoided. My hand was reaching for the doorknob when I heard my own name. The sound stopped me dead, my entire body going rigid with shock. There was no mistaking it. One of the voices had clearly spoken my full name, followed by what sounded like a detailed description of my appearance, my habits, my reasons for being there. The voice knew things about me that no one should have known, private thoughts and concerns I had never shared with anyone. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. The recording on my phone showed only silence, the audio levels flat and unchanging despite the conversation I was still clearly hearing. My grip on reality began to slip, the edges of my perception growing soft and unreliable. That's when I saw the window. The guest room had a large bay window that faced the side yard, its glass panels reflecting my flashlight beam back at me in fractured segments. But etched into the condensation on the outside of the glass were footprints, human footprints that began at the base of the window and traveled upward along the glass surface, as if someone had been walking vertically up the exterior wall. My throat closed completely, cutting off all airflow. The footprints were fresh, the condensation still beating around their edges. They were large, the impressions of heavy boots, and they led from the ground level up to the window, and then continued upward, disappearing into the darkness above. What made them impossible, what sent ice flooding through my veins, was that they were on the outside of a second-story window, 20 feet off the ground, with no ledge, no ladder, no conceivable way for a human being to have made them. The voices inside the room grew louder, more insistent. Through the chaos of my terror, I began to understand that they were talking about me, about my presence in the house, about something they needed me to do. The deeper voice spoke of preparations that had been made, of waiting that was finally coming to an end. The higher voice continued to protest, mentioning something about consent, about the rules that had to be followed. I forced myself to approach the window, my legs shaking so violently I had to brace myself against the wall. The footprints were undeniably real, pressed into the glass with a clarity that made my rational mind scream in denial. I followed their path upward with my flashlight beam until they disappeared into the shadows of the roof overhang. Then I heard something that sent me into complete panic. The sound of footsteps on the roof directly above me. They were slow, deliberate, and seemed to be moving toward the front of the house. Each step sent a vibration through the old wooden frame that I could feel in my bones. The voices in the room had gone silent, as if they too were listening to whatever was moving overhead. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps that fogged the air in front of my face. The footsteps stopped directly above the guest room window. What happened next defied every law of physics I understood. The footprints on the glass began to move, shifting and reshaping themselves as if the impression was being made in real time by something I couldn't see. New prints appeared above the existing ones, then more, creating a path that descended the window toward the ground level. But there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow, nothing but the inexplicable evidence of movement by something invisible. Inside the room, the voices resumed with renewed urgency. I could now understand much of what they were saying, and the words filled me with a dread so profound it felt like drowning. They spoke of a bargain that Morris had made, of obligations that transferred with ownership of the house, of a debt that needed to be paid. The deeper voice explained with clinical detachment that every owner of the house became part of an arrangement that had existed for generations, a compact that required participation rather than mere residence. The higher voice, which I now realized belonged to Morris himself, continued to argue that I hadn't agreed to anything, that the rules required willing participation. But the deeper voice was adamant that my presence here, my decision to stay despite the warnings, constituted implied consent. The legal concept was being twisted into something far more sinister, a supernatural contract written in implications and assumptions. I stumbled out of the guest room and down the stairs, my flashlight beam wild and erratic. Behind me, the voices followed, not bound by the physical limitations of the room, but traveling through the walls themselves. They discussed my options with the dispassionate tone of lawyers reviewing a case, outlining scenarios that ranged from cooperation to consequences I couldn't bear to contemplate. In the kitchen, I fumbled for my car keys with hands that felt disconnected from my body. The voices were all around me now, emanating from the walls, the ceiling, the floorboards beneath my feet. They spoke of others who had tried to leave, of the various ways the house had of ensuring compliance. Morris's voice grew more desperate, warning me about the things that waited outside, the entities that had been summoned to ensure that bargains were kept. I made it to the front door before I heard the sound that stopped me cold, the scraping of fingernails against glass, coming from every window in the house simultaneously. The sound was methodical, rhythmic, like someone tapping out a code. I pressed my back against the door, my eyes darting from window to window as I tried to locate the source. Through each pane of glass, I could see the same impossible sight, footprints appearing and disappearing on the exterior surface, sometimes ascending, sometimes descending, always moving with purpose and intelligence. The voices explained with patient clarity that the house existed at a crossroads between worlds, a place where certain agreements could be made and certain prices paid. Morris had discovered this during his years of isolation, had eventually embraced the role that came with ownership. He had served as a conduit, a facilitator for exchanges that occurred in the spaces between reality and possibility. Now that responsibility was mine. I could feel my sanity fraying at the edges, my perception of reality becoming fluid and unreliable. The footprints on the windows were spreading, multiplying, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. The voices were no longer coming from specific locations, but seemed to originate inside my own head, as if my thoughts were being narrated by entities I couldn't see or understand. But in the chaos of my terror, I began to understand something crucial. The choice was still mine. The deeper voice might claim implied consent, but Morris's continued protests suggested that some form of free will remained. The house wanted cooperation, not subjugation. It needed willing participation to complete whatever process was being described. I made my decision in an instant of clarity that cut through the supernatural fog surrounding me. Instead of fleeing, I walked to the center of the living room and spoke directly to the entities I couldn't see. I acknowledged their presence, their claims, their long history with the house. But I also made clear that I understood the nature of choice, the power of explicit refusal, the strength that came from conscious decision rather than passive acceptance. The effect was immediate and profound. The scratching at the windows stopped. The footprints faded from the glass. The voices ceased their debate and fell silent. For a moment, the house felt truly empty for the first time since my arrival. Then Morris's voice returned, but different now. Clearer, more present, filled with something that might have been gratitude. He explained that conscious refusal was as powerful as conscious acceptance, that the house respected those who made informed decisions rather than stumbling blindly into obligations. My acknowledgement of the supernatural reality, combined with my explicit rejection of participation, had satisfied the requirements in a way that simple flight never could have. The house released its hold on me with an almost audible sigh. I left that night, but not in panic. I drove away with the strange calm that comes from facing the impossible and emerging with my agency intact. The house would be sold, but not to an unsuspecting buyer. I would ensure that future owners understood what they were accepting, that they made informed choices about the responsibilities that came with inhabiting a place where reality wore thin. Behind me, the Victorian mansion settled back into watchful silence, patient as always, waiting for someone who might choose differently than I had. The footprints were gone from the windows, but I knew they would return for the next owner, offering the same choice I had faced: embrace the darkness or consciously walk away. I chose the light of knowledge over the darkness of ignorance, and in doing so, found the strength to leave the shadows behind.